And at the beginning of it all, one morning at the military camp, our protagonist is woken up. Then a friend next to him asks if there's something in his boot, noticing that it's a cockroach. And he tells everyone to shut up, and he says his name is Anclid, and after causing a lot of trouble, he was demoted to squad leader of those idiots. And everyone is living peacefully, until a war breaks out and he orders everyone to attack. And he says he doesn't have any special powers or anything like that. While the war rages on, he says that he managed to get there with tireless training and continues fighting on the front with his sword and shield, and so he kills people along the way. And getting beaten up a lot too. But he makes it very clear that this is his end. While a man almost punches him in the face. But in that, a soldier from his team manages to cut off that man's head. But he still doesn't have his sword, which he dropped while thinking he has no talent. And he knows that his dream is out of reach. And so he picks up his sword again and starts running, until an arrow hits the guy he defended, and he gets more and more scared, while he thinks that he hoped that even if everyone laughed at him and said that his dream would never come true, he thought that as long as he held a sword he would become a knight. But while he is more lost than a blind man in a shootout in all that confusion, he ends up receiving a sword right in the middle of his chest. With that, he realizes that that was a very innocent dream while he dies on the battlefield. And so, as he bleeds and falls to his knees, he feels his life is over and thinks that he never knew his death would be so pathetic. But then, a blue flame appears before his eyes, and he wakes up in a completely different place, in a pool of water that seems to be suspended in the middle of that entire ocean of stars. And in that, he hears metal knocks and wakes up once more. Then he wonders if it was a dream, but the man next to him is once again startled by that cockroach, so he wonders if it is déjà vu, and returns to that same battle once again. And the result ends up being the same, with him being killed for the second, third, fourth, and so on and so forth. Every time he wakes up scared, with the sensation of the enemy's sword piercing his throat, with him feeling that burning pain, the blood, the vomit, and all that euphoria of the battlefield. And he says that this day kept repeating itself over and over again, and he always died to the same enemy. I dropped Sobaru's work so I could see a manhwa about Sobaru. It's a joke. So, as that knight lunges at him with that perfect thrust, he is completely frightened, saying that the tip of the blade that he saw for the 17th time that killed again. He dies in agony again, and he says that if he had handled the sword with a little more effort, he wouldn't be dying like that, and so that knight just takes the sword out of the protagonist's neck and goes on his way, while he thinks that if he had tried a little harder. But things would be different and he wouldn't be in that bloodbath there. And he wonders if perhaps he would have died in that place. And he returns once again to that place where his soul goes every time he dies. Then that light appears again and someone questions whether Prota really thinks so. Then he wakes up and gets up, and that boatman who should be Sharon appears behind Prota, ordering him to fight, and tells him to feel properly and give up, feeling despair in the face of a line he cannot cross. But then, instead of getting more sullen, he feels more and more hate. Again that same day, and he is no longer surprised, so when he gets up he talks to the king this time, saying that there is an insect in his boot. So when he notices, he picks up the cockroach and ends up stepping on it and wonders who put it there, asking what kind of nonsense this ADS, but Cendric tells him to shut up because he already saw him crawling earlier, so he thinks that this is the 18th time he comes across the corpse of that damn insect, and wonders if he sees it a few more, sometimes he will be able to finish the day. And he says that since he was young he wielded a sword, and since he was little he trained, and he says that he learned the technique with the retired mercenary, which coincidentally was his village. Then the guy tells him that he is amazing, saying that if he is already this good, in the future he can even become a knight. And so, with these words he began to dream, and as time passed he thought about being a knight, one of those who can kill 1,000 people alone, and change the dynamics of a battlefield. So he thinks of this invincible hero in his mind, imagining becoming the knight who can end a war, already dreaming of being called the Knight of the End. And he thought he was the protagonist of the song that the wandering troubadour sang. And so he decided to leaving the village and become a knight. But when he faced reality, already in a tavern, people started to laugh at him, the novice, who felt pathetic. They laugh at him, who is a coward who was afraid of a simple stray dog. And they wonder if this person dreams of becoming a knight. And they say that he is not even good enough to be a wandering mercenary. And with that, the boy, all hurt, feels the pressure of reality and says that he, who left the village and joined a group of mercenaries, learned that his talent might not be anything special. But it was too early for him to give up after one failure. And he begins to convince himself that hard work will never fail him. Rock talks to Diego, and he thinks to himself that if he had no talent, he believed that with time and effort things could change directly on the field of battle, and he gradually improved, while convincing himself that he could overcome everything with just that. And he killed beasts along the way, gaining experience, and he says that he gained strength and endurance to be recognized by those around him. He thought more and more that he was becoming strong, thinking that he could become a knight. But this strong hope began to crumble one day, when he was fighting a battle, at the exact moment that he lost his sword and was knocked out by someone much younger. And he says that this hope began to crumble. And there was a child in the village where he was who asked for a duel. And so the child simply looked at him with a bored look, saying that that old man is weak. And so he says that he was 12 years old and had only started learning fencing 6 months ago. And the imbecile who spent more than a decade wielding a sword to the point of having his palms shattered was infinitely more pathetic than the 6 months of a genius. Admit it, he began to feel as if all his effort had been in vain. If there really was no way for him to make it a reality. And so, as time passed, he kept thinking that he wanted to become a knight. And even with everyone belittling him, saying that his dream was impossible, he thought that by spending much less time eating and sleeping than others, swinging and swinging his sword, one day he would be able to reach where no one has reached. But as he trains, he looks at that tree that was his companion. Then he thinks that even if he can't become a knight, he can at least be an experienced soldier. And so he continued training full of hatred, almost becoming guts. And 3 years later, in the present, in the Divine Cypros, for companies, for platoons, and below that, the 4 squads. And he became the commander of a squad called Second Rate. And he says that this was the best position he could achieve after his tireless training. But still, being a regular soldier of the kingdom, it's better than being a wandering mercenary. Then he talks to Jackson, who was behind him, and the boy questions what happened. And he tells him to do the morning rotation for that day. And Jackson looks at him with a lot of disdain in his eyes, telling him to pay him later. And so, Rin calls the boy a mean bastard, saying he looks like a wildcat, mainly with the way he looks at him. And so, Cendric talks to Rin, asking if he's also going to try to push something, but then he talks about the heart of the beast, saying he wants to try to learn it again. Then Rin questions if he didn't give up trying to learn it last time, asking if he thinks he'll be able to do it now. But then they go to training, while Proto thinks that the hand-to-hand battle between Nalal and Aspen, which started again, and that battle in which he died, made him come back to life and start reliving the same day over and over again. And in the middle of the training, he thinks that although he learns the heart of the beast with Rin every time he comes back to life, he still can't see the tip of the sword that stabs him every time. And he thinks that that day he will definitely succeed. And so he goes with his pilot to the middle of that battlefield. And that is already his 21st time on that battlefield. As he gives his all in this return, he thinks that he has already completely memorized that repetitive situation. And stretching his neck as if he were Luffy, he manages to evade several of the attacks that he already knows are going to happen. And he says that he dodged the spear that comes from behind him, and the next attack is from a guy who is behind him, and in that he continues to run away from everyone, and he also remembers a member of another squad saying that he will die soon, but then he takes action protecting that man, saying that he died last time. But in that, death continues to chase him, and another soldier tries to kill him from behind, but Proto takes another action, killing that man too who was threatening his ally, and he thinks it worked because even having blocked the first arrow, he died immediately. He completed his first objective of that day, and he thinks that the rest now is to kill that man who he always kills. So he finds that guy, finishes off another ally of his. He looks at Proto, who thinks that he always ends up facing that guy without fail. And he walks towards Cendric, then he says that that man grabbed his neck and killed him 20 times, but this time he will be able to survive. So, as the guy goes after him, he remembers Rin warning him about something, saying that he always closes his eyes in a dangerous situation, and so he grabs the axe he's throwing up and aims at the protagonist's neck with the intention of killing. And there really is no other way. That idiot closes his eyes once more. However, Haim tells him to look, saying that if he does that on the battlefield, he'll die immediately, and tells him that he needs to be brave and not let himself be agitated or intimidated easily. And he tells him to become a bastard who knows nothing about death, like a beast. And he looks at Cendric with a totally psychopathic look, the same as that man he killed. Every time he has it in his eyes. However, this time, Proto keeps his eyes on the tip of his sword, and he thinks that a beast does not know death. And he begins to wonder if he is afraid of it. He thinks not, because death makes him stronger. This time, he manages to get his neck out of the direction of that sword, running away from it and not letting himself be killed. And so, in that adrenaline, his heart beats faster and faster. And he thinks that for the first time, in that 20th attempt, he managed to dodge his blow for the first time. But then, when he turns around in the euphoria to try to hit his opponent, that opponent has already turned around, changing his grip and throwing his sword at Prota's neck. So, in that 21st attempt in which he managed to dodge the first attack, he couldn't dodge the second one, so he goes back to Sharon once more, who he says that on that endless day he was trapped, in pain and desperate, telling Prota to give up and get on the boat, telling him to recognize his weakness and be at peace. But even with him prostrate, he refuses to do it, waking up once more that day, thinking that on his 22nd day, he will challenge death again. Man, but then the guy he's facing is also a cheat. The guy missed, changed wielder in a split second. He came back, struck Prota's throat, and took the sword away before he fell to the ground. So, back to the war on the 33rd time, he thinks he can clearly see that man's sword and he says he will dodge it before his sword reaches him. But on Tyke's return, he ends up being killed once again, and he barely manages to dodge and gets grazed on the side of his neck, and once again, he dies. As he falls, that pendant on his neck falls to the ground. Then, he remembers that in his days as a mercenary, he accepted some requests to subdue monster. And it wasn't like he was obligated to do it. He simply found a random village where they asked him for help, and the reason why he decided to help them was because his dream was to become a knight, and protecting the weak is a knight's duty. And so the village leader tells him that his village is poor, so that's all they can give him, and when he looks at his reward he notices that it's an amulet, and he says that it was a ridiculous reward for the price of eradicating his life, but at that moment that man told him that that amulet consider what he desperately desires, so he wonders if it could be because of that, wondering if that amulet is making that day repeat itself, just so he can become a knight, but this time while he's lying in pain on the ground. That Knight approaches him, saying that he must be in pain, saying that there goes a flick of his mercy, about to plunge the sword into Prota's back, and he thinks that mercy is shit, looking into the eyes of that bloodthirsty killer smiling as he kills him, telling him that he's just a pervert who gets pleasure from piercing people. So once again he wakes up that same day, talking to Ren this time that I put a bug in that boot. Then he wonders what the hell is this, saying that he's been doing tricks early in the day, asking if he's finally gone crazy. Then, Cendric tells him to stop grumbling and come to him, telling him to teach him the heart of the beast. And so he goes back to training once more, and this time he manages to keep his eyes open, escaping Ren's attack. Then he asks what he's been doing, questioning how the skin on his heart got thicker so suddenly. And so, Cendric says that he trained. But he says that this isn't something that can happen so quickly. But then he thinks that this has happened more than 10 times. He says that there's no way a secret technique from his family can be taught to someone else, but Cendric says that it really is like he said, it's a feeling that he learned from death. But he disguises it, asking what's so important about it, saying that maybe it got thick by accident, trying to disguise it. And this time he calls Ren to have a sword fight. He finds it strange, but thinks it's great. And so, even though he lost the beast heart, he thinks he'll be killed if he can't land a thrust. And he tries to fight this time with Ren faster, dodging his axe and dodging with everything. Then Ren questions how long he'll dodge, trying to hit the protagonist with all his momentum. And Cendric thinks that the only sword technique he has now is the sword technique of the mercenary Valen, which is an anomalous technique made by a mercenary known as Valen, and some people speak ill of hers, and others call it a petty trick, so Rin goes all out on him, saying that Cendric's lower body strength is quite weak, but the Prota thinks that even so, among the ones he has, this is definitely the most decent technique. Then, as he gets into battle stance, Ren feels something, and the Prota remembers that stab he's experienced dozens of times, attacking Ren this time. And by a hair's breadth, he manages to knock the sword out of the Prota's hand, throwing it far away. Then he notices that, for a moment, he imitated that pervert's stab, and he thinks he's already died from his stab, more than 10 times, and his body remembers, and Ren starts that talking. This should have had some blood, saying that among what he's shown so far, that stab was the most decent, showing him how it should be done, saying that it should have some impact, and he says that his hand should have bled, and he starts to notice that since he is the one who lot of himself and says that this attack cannot miss, but Seneki questions that if it is blocked, what should he do next, and Rin says that he should say that he cannot dodge it, and say that his opponent is dead now, and that will make him not lose his grip on his sword. Then he starts to look at his hand, thinking that even though he explained it badly, he understood what he meant. And the difference between his thrust and that guy's thrust is that he has no confidence in his sword. And once again, on that battlefield, The man who always kills him gives him his mercy again, which is certainly the last thing on his mind. And he says he must stab with the intent to kill. And he goes on training death after death with run and dying at that guy's hands, taking one step at a time, but then he thinks he won't, saying he'll advance even if it's just a quarter of a step, and he keeps dying time after time. And so, on the 111th day, once again he's about to die. And on the 123rd day, he keeps dying. And finally, on the 124th day, he attacks Run with the most hatred possible and manages to throw his axe away. But at this, Run finds him strange, asking if he's crazy, besides the fact that his hands are finished and gushing blood, and he questions why Cendric is laughing like a madman. And this time, finally, he managed to see the madness of a berserker, noticing that he mastered that perverted bastard. My friend, this is getting good. Okay, he's playing with death, he's dying like there's a morning every time. I want to see this shit, but it's getting good, and now I want to see him face that guy. And already on the battlefield, he thinks he has to go a little faster, with pure murderous intent, going after that man. Then he finally manages to hit him, but the attack hits his helmet, while the man manages to hit him in the throat, and he reports that his first attempt to stab was a failure, and he thinks he won't blink, and won't let go of his sword. He says that everything that happened, from every time their swords clashed to now, he says that it's all in his head, while that guy steps on his chest, saying that it looks like he's suffering, saying that he'll give him mercy by killing him, but before dying, Cendric looks straight into that pervert's eye, saying that tomorrow he'll die. But then that guy smiles sadistically, telling Prota that the dead have no tomorrow. And with that, the amulet starts working again. Prota wakes up that same day and, this time, takes the cockroach out of Heim's shoe, killing it himself, and says that he saw him coming in a while ago. And so, Rin just thanks him. And he says that if Run is grateful, then he should take on his guard duty. Then he asks why he's giving him orders so casually. And he says that this is the mark of the 125th day. Then he calls Zyoto, a boy from his company, and asks him to get him some armor for his shins, a shield and a dagger, saying that he will pay him for them later. And he thinks about this later, telling Sander that he will do this because he is the boss. And normally he does not do favors for anyone, asking if he knows about this. Then, Rin questions if the squad commander has ever been so insistent with his commands, and Jackson starts saying that they always push their tasks onto him, calling them lazy. Rin questions what he said, asking if he wants to taste his axe. Then everyone there starts to find it strange, while Rin thinks that this guy is really acting strange, saying that he is not usually so intense. My friend, after the third death, he's laughing like a joker, like a madman. Only God knows what goes through the clown's mind. And so, while Prota trains with his friend the tree, he thinks that he feels an incredible amount of pain every time he dies. And the possibility of never winning, even after thousands and tens of thousands of times, crosses his mind, because that guy scares him a lot. He wonders if it would be possible to find a way to escape and survive, wondering if he would sleep and wake up tomorrow, or even wake up that day, and he accepts that he is stronger now than before, wondering if everything isn't okay and being satisfied with it, but he thinks it isn't, saying that this is not an option for him, thinking that he has to overcome that wall and learn to stock up. And so he keeps attacking the tree with everything and thinks that he will not abandon this blessing. So he finally splits the tree in half and prepares to go into battle, thinking that he has to keep advancing. And once on the battlefield, while all the troops are getting organized, he takes the lead. And so, when the battle breaks out, he thinks that he, a person with no skill, managed to survive this battle because of three things. Thinking that the first is preparation, the second is luck, the third is a cool head. And on his 46th day, his left shoulder was shattered by a spiked mass. And on the 47th day, he rolled to avoid the mass, but someone crushed his head, and he added a spin to cut it first. So on the 71st day, the soldier below cut his spike. So he can't do anything against the pervert of the stab, but this time he has a hard armor right on his shin, and with that he manages to defend himself and kill that man. So he thinks that on the 89th his head was cracked by someone who threw his axe. So he thinks that if he lets him live, he stops his fight with the pervert of the stab. So letting him live is not an option. And he trained to throw weapons throughout his countless trainings. So it's not difficult. And so he manages to kill that man. And after all that, one of his allies starts screaming behind him. He thinks that that guy always ends up there. So he almost gets hit by an arrow, but Prota manages to defend his friend, thinking that a sniper who is called Hawklaw is coming. But he doesn't have time to kill him, because someone else turns his attention back to his ally. But Prota manages to cut off his head easily. So he thinks it's time for him to face the wall. So the pervert starts going towards Prota, aiming at him with his usual murderous gaze. But this time, the two stare at each other with a psychopathic look, because Prota is no longer the same. They stand face to face, And when the man tries to attack him, Prota manages to defend himself with his shield. So he thinks that dodging and stabbing alone doesn't give him any chance of winning, and he thinks that this serves him better. So he goes all out against the soldier, thinking he's just an ordinary, but strong one, almost at the level of a prodigy. And the enemy notices that Prota seemed to be attacking him, but in fact he was blocking him, and he is surprised by this. And Ingrid in turn thinks that he lacks real combat experience, so he is easily surprised, and then he headbutts his enemy, and says that Valen's mercenary sword technique, with its many variations, is effective against him, and then he digs the tip of his foot into the ground, and throws the sand in his enemy's eye, raising his sword and almost hitting him. But then his enemy acts quickly, looking with only 2 eyes. He is still covered in sand and tries to stab Prota, but he manages to dodge, putting his head to the side, and he passes right through. But the soldier quickly turns around trying to strike again. However, Prota now knows this. As he tries to strike again, Ingrid thinks he knows everything there is to know about that blow and stabs his sword into the tip of the pervert's sword, breaking it completely. But then, an archer from afar shoots his arrow towards the two. While that guy loses his arrow, Prota prepares to hit him, thinking he's won. But then the arrow that was heading towards them ends up finding a hammer in the middle of the path, breaking it in half, making it unable to reach the projectile and, finally, killing the pervert. Meanwhile, Ren says he's going to kill that bastard Hawkclaw. But then Jackson says it's too late, telling him not to waste his energy. Then Prota finally kills his nemesis with a stab. While he's on the ground bleeding, Prota stops in the middle of the battlefield, completely satisfied with the result. While he is kneeling, he moves his sword, looking into the eyes of the man he killed hundreds of times, saying that this is mercy, and finally rips off his head. He smiles as he does so, thinking that he has finally broken the wall. But then he forgets that he is in the middle of a war, being kicked away, and he falls to the ground, feeling an enormous pain, screaming. And just like that, everyone notices that something has happened, and they notice that that is Frog. And apparently, that thing over there is not human. And then, while Prota is on the ground moaning in pain, Frog says that he invested a lot in creating that one, saying that he can't believe that someone like him defeated him. And when he looks at that thing gushing blood from where his head should be, Prota starts to pant, and Frog prepares to kill him, swinging his axe at him. But then Rin steps in front of Prota, but while he lowers Frog's axe, he tries to hit him, but Frog also stops his attack. And Ren goes all out in a totally insane fight against Frog. Meanwhile, while Prota is lying on the ground, he almost dies at the hands of another soldier. But then Jackson arrives and rips off his head, and Frog and Ren continue fighting that battle. Face to face. And Ren thinks that if he wants to decapitate his squad leader, he needs his permission first. But Frog questions if that weakling over there is their leader, asking if it isn't Ren. But at that, Ren doesn't even answer him and thinks about the frog warrior race, born to fight, saying that he'll have to burn that damn frog with magic or pierce his heart with a single blow, thinking that this is a huge nuisance, and Frog, in turn, wonders why. Someone like him is in a trivial battlefield like that and thinks that to kill him he'll have to risk his life, since Ren is apparently absurdly strong. Then Freud starts walking sideways, thinking that this battle isn't worth it. He prepares to turn his back and leave, and he actually does so, turning his back on his enemy, and Ren thinks he's a huge coward. I noticed, this frog guy looks a lot like an evolved Greninja with dreadlocks. Yeah, it's pretty bizarre, but it's a Greninja. And with that, Jackson starts to walk across the entire battlefield, while carrying Prota on his back. So, Ren defends him, ripping off the heads of everyone who tries to attack him. And the other one, the same one from Prota's platoon, also helps, clearing the way while everyone tries to stop there while he goes back to the camp. But then they form a front, defending both Jackson and Prota. And so they retreat, and Prota is calmer because that day is finally over. And so a drop falls into that ocean, where he always returns after death, and he apparently goes back there once more. And Sharon tells him that he managed to survive for a day, but says that's all, because he won't be able to handle the walls that will keep appearing in his path, saying that his destiny is to despair and give up. But then Prota thinks about this destiny and gets up, and looking at the ghost of the one he decapitated when he broke the wall. Then he talks to Sharon, saying that for him, walls exist to be overcome. Then, Sharon says he is anxious for the moment when those eyes full of greed and ambition will completely lose their shine. And so he wakes up in the camp, all bandaged, noticing that that place is an infirmary, and Ren talks to him, saying that he had no 2 days in a row. Then he says that he saved that damn frog, asking if Prota remembers, and he thinks about this frog, remembering the pain he is feeling, and he notices that in the end it was a frog, saying that it is incredible that he survived, and Rin says that his bones were not broken. However, they said that his head was badly affected, asking if he remembers him, his best friend forever. He says that he never said they were friends, calling him a noble hunter, but the king tells him to shut up, because there are other people there. He wonders if just because it's someone's secret that he has nothing to do with, that means he can just reveal it. Then Prota says that he's either someone he has nothing to do with or his best friend, telling him to choose one. And so, a new day beyond today begins because he survived. So, Soyoto orders his commander to pay 3 times as much, asking if he knows how much it cost him to get in there, and here he is crass. Prota says that he was wondering why a regular soldier like him, who would be left to fend for himself, managed to get into the infirmary. But then he remembers that the boy was nowhere to be found during the battle, as usual. So he has nothing to say, saying that he'll give Prota a special discount, saying that he'll only pay twice as much. And in the afternoon, Jackson goes to Prota, and he questions what happened, because if he has something to say, he should say it right away. And with that, he throws something to Prota, and simply turns around, telling him to use it morning and night, using it twice a day, and not to ask where he got it from. And he thinks that this is the ointment that Jackson used to use, and he wonders if he didn't hate sharing personal items. Meanwhile, Aldine also goes there to laugh at Prota. He tells him to just go away because he's not dead, and so he questions what their agreement is about taking turns, especially after all this time when they were busy doing whatever they wanted, asking if they are worried about him, or it could be that they were waiting for him to sleep. But then, Ragnar enters the infirmary finding it strange, asking why the commander is there. But then they just turned around and left, and thinks that there is no way Ragnar could be worried, saying that that scoundrel doesn't care about him at all. He thinks that besides him, there are 2 soldiers in the infirmary, and one is the platoon commander of another company who used to fight with him, and the other is a soldier whose name he doesn't know, who just spends his time staring into space, and he notices that he looks like a low-ranking soldier, asking how he got there. But then, while he is scanning everyone in the room, someone fills the tab and he finds it strange, noticing that that person is not a normal human. And apparently that woman is a noble elf with a lot of status in that army. So she asks who is the commander of the 444th Squadron. And Prota is in eternal doubt while he sees that woman ask that question. And in that commander who doesn't like Prota asks if she is a fairy, and she asks which group he belongs to, and he says he is Vengeance, the commander of the 3rd pilot of the 2nd company, and in that she asks if his company teaches to say your race when you meet your superior. Then he apologizes and Prota realizes that she is a superior, noticing that she is the new commander of the 4th company, and Enkred introduces himself to her, saying he is the commander of the 4th Squadron of the 4th Company and 4th Platoon, considering so well his problematic squadron members, saying that he eagerly awaits his contributions. So he wonders if she came there just to say that. But then she stops, asking what the name of the last one there is, and the kid makes a totally random mistake and says it's Krang. But then Prota wonders if he just made that up because his attitude in front of the company commander is also pretty bad, asking if he's a noble, and the girl just looks at him and leaves, and Prota doesn't. He doesn't really understand this, so at night he notices that he's getting better and says that most of the pain if he goes now, he can put strength in his body, thinking that he should start training. And Vengeance asks where he's going, and he says he's going to the training area. But he says that guy is an idiot because he's acting all tough when he's a low-ranking soldier, and Krang just watches him walk away. And so he picks up that sword again, thinking he needs to remember the past battle. And he says it's one of the new useful methods he spent a lot of money to learn when he was young. And he also thinks about the stab he made at the last moment, wondering what would have happened if that last desperate attack had failed. And he starts to realize that it's not a good idea to put all his eggs in one basket. And if that attack fails, he'll definitely die. And he thinks that if Ren's axe attacks are all lethal, then after thrusting with all his strength, he would have to make a next move. But then someone comes along saying he's working on Doru and he gets a fright. And Krang appears sitting next to him, saying that he doesn't know what he's doing. But his hands kept twitching in the tents and now he's just there looking at nothing. He thinks he was doing this to train his grip strength. Then he says that he's replicating the battle. But then Crank asks why he's doing that. And he says that it's so he doesn't get screwed. But he questions what if he doesn't get screwed, questioning if he wants to become something while preserving his life. And the Protan understands that boy very well and thinks that what he wants to become is his dream. But when he says it out loud, people laugh at him, so he looks up and says that a dream he's already achieved with his humble talent, but a dream that he never stopped wanting to achieve. And so he raises his sword, thinking that he wants to become a knight. And Krang is surprised by this, so he thinks it's the first time he's seen something like this. Someone who didn't laugh at him, And Krang thinks to himself that he has forgotten to laugh, saying that he suddenly remembered something, and he understood what he needed to do after observing him. Then he just gets up and leaves, while Prota thinks this is news to him. And Krang turns around, saying that if he becomes a knight, he must remember your name calling you friend, and he thinks it's the first time he's been supported, and so everyone is singing there on his equipment. Wondering who the hero of the battlefield is, who they say is Cyphros, and already in the infirmary tent Prota can no longer stand being next to that guy complaining all the time, and he thinks that after waking up because of the wandering wanderer and waiting for the late breakfast, he gave quiet walk instead of going to the training area, and he passes Jackson asking how his injuries are, and he says the medicine worked well thanking him, but then he says if he's grateful, he should be. Hurry up and come back soon. And already in the infirmary at night, Krang says goodnight to Anchorage. He also wishes his friend good night. He thinks sleeping early is all he does. Meanwhile, that guy who isn't happy with life, tell them to shut up, telling them they're talking shit. And so, Prota thinks that that was a day of doing nothing. But then in the morning he is woken up by that wanderer. And he notices that the wanderer has come again, wondering why he went back to his walker. But then that annoying commander starts complaining again that the food is late, so Prota thinks he's so noisy and is saying the same thing as last day. But in this, he realizes that something is wrong. So he gets up and goes for a walk again. And Jackson talks to him, asking again how his injuries are. Then he says that the medicine worked, doing the same script as last day. So he thinks that something is very wrong happening. And he is sure, saying that this is the same day as yesterday. And so, Sharon says that another wall will stop him, and he must try to survive. And so he realizes that while he was sleeping, he died without realizing it. And he realizes that he died in a more desperate way than when he was stabbed. Although he feels like crap, it makes him more determined, thinking that this is another challenge. And so, at bedtime, he wonders how and who he killed, because the enemy needs to get past all the defenses to get there, and if it is possible for knights, but he thinks that this is unlikely, then it must be a hidden assassin, and it is highly likely that the assassin is among them. And he thinks that he knows the location of the medical tents and hides his presence from someone skilled in assassination. And he remembers that woman who looked right at him, and he is frightened by it, because the silent feet and the action of a fairy are perfect for assassination. And the reason why she came that day was to discover the location of Antimo. He starts to imagine everything she could be doing, and he thinks that who needs to come to confirm this, and there is only one entrance to the medical tents, and he can end it by screaming and waking up the other soldiers the moment he just needs to wait for the assassin. But then he dies without even knowing where it came from, because of a needle stuck right in his neck. He realizes that it is a poisonous needle, and he didn't even see the assassin come in. Then he begins to agonize, falling to the ground, thinking that he can't move his body or speak, and it is a powerful paralyzing poison. Then he realizes that this is why he died without knowing the reason. And he notices that the other commanders of the Vengeance Platoon and Krang are also dying. He notices that that bastard is the assassin. And in this he kills Krang, sticking a sword in the boy's chest. He dies without having any chance. And so Prota becomes totally possessed by hatred. And a sword notices that there is another assassin. But this time the person who enters is that same woman who appeared in the morning. And so already the next morning, this is the third time he is living that day, and he thinks he was alert, but he could not detect her presence, thinking that this will not be easy. Besides, that company commander, even if he manages to stop the assassins, he will still have to face that commander soon after. So he starts to feel imposing, and he thinks that he felt the same way a few days ago too when he was facing that knight, but he says that despite that, he was the winner, so he thinks that he will surely find a way, as long as he does not give up. And then he goes to that annoying captain, lifting his blanket, and he questions what's wrong with the guy, asking if he's going crazy. And Ingrid says she was wrong to assume that the assassins would have already infiltrated the base by now. So he thinks he should keep an eye on the outside and takes his sword, but at that, he still thinks he's crazy, asking if that day's training is to catch cockroaches with a sword, saying he thinks that's appropriate for low-level soldiers. But Zankard doesn't. He follows through on his cheap provocation, saying he didn't know he put up with him so much. But at that, he says he was being sarcastic and starts to insult him. So, Anchorage thinks he was being sarcastic too. And the guy starts telling him to go fuck himself, saying he doesn't even want to see his face anymore. And then Krang arrives, noticing that the two are arguing again and asks if he should come back later. But then Prota says that it's okay, telling him to come in. But then he keeps watching that guy, saying that considering how the assassins were so attentive to him, he's sure that that kid is their target. thinking that he's a suspect, but he wonders who exactly he is. But he thinks that he won't investigate something that he's not willing to tell him without asking. So he goes to his company, saying that thanks to him, he was involved in the assassination attempt. So he thinks that there's no other way, talking to Crank, saying that he'll ask, questioning who he is. And Krang doesn't quite understand the question, while Proto wonders if he did something wrong, because maybe his communication skills are on par with Krang. Krang thinks about this question for a bit, saying that this isn't something he can tell him, and Proto asks why not, and Krang says it's a long story, and so Anchor just accepts it, but that guy back there starts to feel his nerves again, saying that if he's going to accept that kind of answer, he shouldn't even ask in the first place, saying that Krang or Crab or whatever his name is, he's definitely not from that country, considering his damn ways. And he tells Krang to be honest, asking which country he's a spy for. Then, Krang looks at him with a very scary look in his eye, and Chateau Mado starts to get a little more awkward, and Krang walks up to him, getting very close to vengeance, saying that he didn't betray and won't betray the kingdom. And so, Proto thinks he can see those eyes of his in his movements, thinking that he, for sure, has the aura of a knight. And Venja wonders if that's how he talks to his superior. But at that, Krang quickly changes those ways, while Proto thinks that Krang isn't a knight. After all, he was also powerless in the face of the assassins. However, he thinks that that boy is definitely hiding something. And so, at night, they wish each other good night again. And Proto wonders if Vengeance is afraid of Krang, because of what happened before, saying that he is strangely calm. But then he notices the entrance to the tent, saying that if the assassins invade there, they would all die, and so he gets up. And Vengeance asks what he's doing instead of sleeping, and he says that assassins will invade that tent soon, telling him to cooperate if he wants to live. But Vengeance doesn't take his words seriously, saying that he must have lost his mind. And Krang also seems to be very calm, and Proto says that he expected this reaction, but then he hears someone asking how he noticed, and ends up being killed with a sword blow from outside to inside the tent. Then he wonders when this happened, since he didn't even have a chance to put his hand on the sword. And Vengeance also gets a big cut on the neck. And lastly, Krang is killed too. As he falls, he tries to see what's going on. But he wakes up the fourth time, saying that since there is no evidence that the assassins are coming, he won't get help from Vengeance or Crane, and he thinks he should inform his superiors to get reinforcements. But then, when he goes to his superior, he questions if he's gone crazy, tells him to get out before he shuts him up forever. Then he thinks that maybe he can lie in wait and predict the moment when the assassins will appear and scream well before they do. Then he wonders if it's now or not. He gets nervous waiting for their attack, but when the attack comes, it pierces his throat without him being able to do absolutely anything. He thinks they're too fast, thinking that there's no way to get help from the others and he needs to ambush them and defeat them before they do anything. But he keeps dying every single time and wonders how he's going to fight an enemy he can't see. While he can't see them, they can see everything. He keeps dying over and over again. He thinks that as long as he can't avoid their poison needle, he'll die without being able to do anything. And so, another morning, he says it's the 20th of them, and he hasn't been able to do anything in any of them for the 20th time in a row, and he gets more and more desperate. But then, a smile hangs on his mouth, saying he's only died 20 times. My friend, this Baluko's brain has already turned to puree. Only 20 times. Imagine dying 20 times in pain, because he says he wakes up with a lot of pain. And every time he doesn't even know what's going on. He claims he needs to think of a way to avoid the poison needle first, and he'll think about how to deal with them later, and says that a way to avoid their attacks faster than they can see would be with Jackson, and he goes there. Then he remembers a conversation he had with the king asking why Jackson would be a wildcat, and the king doesn't quite understand. And Anchorage remembers that's what he calls him. Then he says because he's the damn pervert Sojo, saying that he never tries to fight his enemies head-on, saying that he likes to stab him in the back and run away, and asks if that doesn't remind him of a wildcat, cunning and perverted. But then, when he gets close to Jackson, he finds it strange, and asks if the wounded are okay now. And it's incredible to think to yourself that he would easily defeat the assassins. But he can't just take him with him, since he doesn't have the authority to do so. And he says that even if he could, this is a wall he must overcome alone. And he thinks that all he needs to do is become Jackson. So he talks to the boy, giving a hypothetical quote, asking what he would have to do if someone tried to stab him in the back, questioning how he could stop him. So Jackson thinks for a bit, saying that he's not sure, saying that no one has ever survived his ambushes. But as he says that, Proda has a bad feeling and widens his eyes. And as he looks at Jackson, he also looks back at him until he lowers his head, saying that the person would need to have eyes in the back of their head. And Proda wonders about this, asking Jackson what this means. And he says it would be perfect timing, asking if he saw that wagon. But it's incredible, he didn't even know there was a wagon there. And he says it's behind the tents. And looking at it, he wonders how Jackson noticed something so far away, wondering if he really has eyes in the back of his head. And with that, Jackson says this is going to go bad. Then the wagon ends up falling, and he was calm, completely right, and Proda is shocked by this, asking if Jackson is a prophet. He says that Enkid must have spent too much time with that barbarian, so he tells him not to provoke him, asking how he knew. Then he says it's about the sound, saying he heard a creaking in the axle of the wagon. And he tells Proda that if he can hear what's going on around him, he can predict what's going to happen next, so he wonders if he heard something so silent, because for his part he doesn't think he even heard the cart coming close. And Jackson says that basically he doesn't need to come to notice what's around him, and he can keep trying to hear what's around him to practice. And they tuned their senses and thus isolated the sounds. He says that was a good explanation, and he even seemed too lazy to answer him before. But in that, Jackson says he's lazy. But it's better for me to do this than to have him following closely all the time. After all, for some time now, the squad leader doesn't seem to give up. And so, already at night, he thinks he's coming up against his second wall. And this one is even worse because it comes in the form of a merciless death. And he thinks he can survive if he can just feel them. And so he thinks about irregular spaces, noticing that it's the patrol, and the sound of torches. But as the killer approaches, he keeps trying to look for him, wondering where he is. And he keeps trying to feel the sound of that bastard. But then, when he hears the noise outside of someone jumping, that needle already sticks in his neck again. And he says that of course he failed. And so, the next day he says that he didn't take a single step forward. But his body clearly remembers everything. The experience of learning, the heart of the beast and the stab. And he goes to Jackson to ask questions again. And he says that he can get a lot of information just from sound. And you can tell the location of something by the intensity and direction of the sound. And once he can hear faint and distant sounds, at that point, his ears basically become his second pair of eyes. So he makes a noise that gets Proda's attention and says that sound is a wave. And this wave resonates in all directions, no matter how quiet it is. And in the case of thousands of sound waves mixed together, he needs to isolate a single wave. And he starts listening to the sound of everyone around him. And Proda starts observing everything and trying to identify each sound. And he thinks that there are many sounds mixed together, thinking that he has to pick out a sound wave intertwined in the middle of all that, and he starts meditating, saying that he needs to listen, categorize, and isolate them. And he thinks of all the flags waving beside him, noticing that they still seem like the only great sound of a flag to him. But then they wonder how many there were, trying to remember if there were 7 or 10. And from right to left, the soldiers marching near him and 2 away, thinking that he's starting to feel the waves and the familiar sounds. And the unfamiliar ones too. But then Krang comes up to him calling him Aunts, asking what kind of training this is, so he chirps about that name. Krang says that Anchorage is his name, so Aunts should be fine, but he says it's not. But let him call him that if that's what he wants. And he just says that he's standing there looking like an idiot, asking if this sounds like training to him. And Anchorage says that he's not an idiot who wastes time, and so he realizes that he knows something. And that night, he dies once more from that poison. And he continues to see Krang die too. And after one more death, he says that this is the 33rd time. Another failure. And on the 34th, he didn't hear anything new. And he keeps having failure after failure. But he keeps training in that time he has in the morning. He says that he doesn't need more experience to overcome this wall, nor divine intervention, nor sudden realization. He just needs to do repeatedly what he needs to do. And so he begins to hear the hawk landing on top of the flag, and he can feel more distinct things seeing Tigrang approaching, opening his eye before he can say anything. He says that this surprised him because he approached him stealthily, but he questions how he knew he was there, saying that Proda kept his eyes closed for a while, asking if he is training his perception. Then he says that he is not really an idiot who wastes time. And so he becomes sharper and sharper, and this time he manages to dodge that needle. And doing so, he quickly pulls out his sword, attacking the assassin. Then, the assassin finally falls back and begins to despair, because this is not something he was expecting. And Anchorage thinks to himself that that assassin is no longer the faceless death. Dude, it's not for nothing, but the guy is becoming truly absurd. They are noticing that now he can look death in the face. Now he can understand it too. And apparently, his troop is also a bunch of absurd animals, because Ren is very strong and now he learned from Jackson how to create the second eye. Increasingly desperate and goes after Proto again, calling him a damn rat, trying to hit him. Yankred thinks that this guy, he is certainly not as good in combat as that perverted stabber and thinks he can deal with him. But then he notices that Vengeance has already died, but Krang is still alive, getting up, but he can't take his eyes off the assassin, who tries to kill him at all costs, and he thinks he shouldn't let his guard down because this guy is still an experienced assassin, and he manages to dodge the first attack, tiredly cuts his chest, and so the assassin continues going forward, but then a sword cuts the tent and Proto is surprised to see that, because it is the ferry commander of the company who is entering, and he thinks that if he doesn't stab her first, he will definitely be the one who dies. But when he goes for her, the assassin asks if he had a guard throwing several of those spikes at the protagonist, and some of them also go at Crank, who tries to defend himself. But while he looks at that, he tries to keep going at the ferry. However, she jumps over anchorage and takes off her cape, defending her skull from all those spikes. He claims to have thought she was with assassins and is surprised that she came to protect them. And he thinks that whatever the case, now is his chance, and so he goes all out for the assassin, trying to kill him, and he actually manages to hit him with the knife, but the assassin stops the attack, and without having much to do, he simply retreats, leaving there. And he becomes calmer, noticing that he ran away, and so Krang notices that that guy was probably after him. And Proto says he knows. He questions how, and Proto questions who would pay an assassin to kill someone insignificant like him or Vengeance. So the fairy says that's exactly it, saying that he's quick to reason. But she puts her hand on her sword and he notices that she was an ally until now, asking if she can't let this be known. And he thinks that she won't leave witnesses, as she grabs her sword. He also prepares for the fight, but Krang steps in, saying he has a favor to ask of her, saying he doesn't want no one to die that day. Then Proto simply understands, and she lowers her head, saying she will do as he wishes. However, Krang says that this also includes that platoon commander over there, saying he's not dead yet, and she says they have an antidote so he should be fine. And so, Proto notices that she must have knowledge about antidotes, and Krang says that now he needs to clean up this mess, because it will be inconvenient if people find out that the killer was there. But then, the question is ready, if it would be okay if there were no traces saying that there is a way, or looking at the flame over there, and so he sets the tent on fire and everyone gets up, getting ready to put out that fire quickly, while he takes the Vengeance out of there. And so they notice that there are 2 survivors, and the Proto thinks that with that the traces of the killer were erased, and they will take care of the consequences. And further away in the middle of the forest, Crank continues walking with the fairy, and she says that if that squad leader hadn't delayed him, he would have died, and asks if he changed his mind because of him. Crank says yes, asking if he isn't interesting, and the fairy doesn't answer while he thinks that, has been trying to avoid this. So, the next day, Proto goes back to his training while Krang leaves, saying that aunts must have influenced him. He says that they will definitely meet again in their respective roles. Since I laid eyes on this guy, I knew that this is no commoner. He must be the king and Proto will become his knight. Right what I'm saying. Right what I'm saying. And so, once again with Sharon and his scythe, he doesn't like it at all because the scythe breaks. Then, Broda appears in front of him and Sharon says that he will see him again. And he says that at any time he will accept him coming. And so he says that he was confronted again by the repetitive today. He survived against that silent death and woke up the next morning. And he thinks he can feel the presence of most things. But he couldn't feel that fairy. And he thinks he has a lot to do when he gets back. And luckily he wasn't hurt, so he can go back right away. And so Vengeance asks if he saved him from the fire, and then him and why. And Anchorage wonders if he's giving him a hard time for saving him, and wonders why he doesn't like him, and he says it's that they're comrades, asking if he needs another reason, and Vengeance is at a loss for words, saying that after all the shit he's done to him, he's a very selfless bastard, and asks if he's going back to his squad, and he says yes. But then Vangan says he's out of luck, because the weather's going to be terrible outside. So Anchor asks you if anything happened, and he says there's a rumor going around that the entire base is cursed. And already at his base, Ragnar tells Rin not to bother him, calling him an underdeveloped monkey, and giving him a big push who gets excited to start fighting. Everyone starts running, saying that some crazy guy squad is fighting again. And Rin simply grabs Ragnar in his arms, wanting to throw him to the ground. Where is the leader of that squad? Because they are like this, because he is not there, and he throws Ragnar on top of a tent, and breaks it completely. Then they tell them not to get close to the 2 of them, because they will get screwed too. And Ragnar goes all out on Rin, breaking a crate on top of him, and so they start exchanging punches, and the fighting starts to begin. Then Ren sees that things are getting serious. Grab your weapons, saying you're going to decorate his skull with your axe. And so they notice that he is armed, ordering everyone to leave. And Ragnar says he will cut that Barbara in half. Then they wonder where the other crazy people are, ordering them to stop. Then Proda arrives, saying that he doesn't know about the base being cursed, but those two bastards could be its curse. And so he arrives, ordering them to stop, revealing that the squad leader has returned, and Ragnar asks if he is still alive and if he didn't die. He thought he had died, but he says he didn't. But he can go crazy because of those two. And so, on a new morning, Proda says that 4 days have passed since he returned to his team. As he wakes up, he notices Jackson by his side, and he says he was trying to leave calmly, asking if he woke up. But he says no, saying he was gonna wake up and work out anyway. And Jackson says he started recently, but it's really good for me to hear. He says he's been practicing, and Jackson tells him to keep it up, because it'll help him someday. And so Proda says that battles are few and far between, especially with winter approaching. So he takes the opportunity to get totally armored, doing the pull-up with just one hand. And he says he's been taking advantage of all this extra time to use it to train. And so they go to him saying good morning. He thinks this completely, noticing Aldine training, doing push-ups under a rock that big. Wow, it's not for nothing, it's really cool to see that on Manhwa and stuff. But how did he get that stone on his back? Did he ask someone, look, put this rock this big on my back so I can do a push-up? And Jim simply, while doing that absurd push-up, asks if he's coming back from his morning workout, saying that he's keeping busy. And so he puts his leg on the ground and says that this is good. However, he says that a well-trained body is a weapon in itself, saying that it should be able to withstand a frog's kick. Crazy, this guy must have a huge one because Proda is not small, but look at his size. And he simply calls Proda a chicken to his face, saying that he's still too skinny, so he has to keep training. But then Proda says that he's the one who's too big and says he'll try. And so, Aldine says that the training technique he mentioned before is very effective, but then they hear Han screaming again and kicking Ragnar out of bed, saying that it's his turn on duty, but he's still sleeping, calling him lazy. And Ragnar simply crawls and grabs his sword, preparing to attack, but Ron doesn't give in and Proda appears asking if they're fighting again. He simply asks for a rest, while Odin says that unbridled violence won't solve anything. But Ren says that Ragnar is the one who will starve him to death, and Proda says that if it's his turn to work, then he just agrees, while Ren says that in the need for all this, they did what had to be done anyway. But Ren keeps provoking him. He doesn't listen. So Proda asks him to stop it, asking if he's bored, and so Ren asks if he noticed, saying that the lack of battle is giving him an itch, but Anchorage tells him not to take it out on just anyone, telling him to go fight him, calling him to a match. And so, while they do that fight, he starts to regret it a little, and Ren says that he needs to take the blows better, so he tries to hit him with the axe, throwing his weapon up, and he almost loses his sword, and he thinks that he has to keep calm with the heart of the beast. And so, while Ren's axe comes, he calmly defends himself and thinks about using the thing he practiced while dying hundreds of times, using the thrust, and almost hits Ren with that, and he manages to dodge very beautifully, grabbing Proda by the collar and putting him on the ground. And Ren says he expected more, since he's improved a lot recently, and questions what made him so boring all of a sudden, saying that stabbing already bored him, asking if he doesn't have anything new. But then, to the note that now he knows because he's different from before, and now he can repeat all the hundreds and thousands of times and move on. Then he tells him to come to him again, saying that he'll destroy him properly this time. But Ren keeps thinking that his skills are completely lacking, but he doesn't get tired of it, seeing those eyes. And so, Ren thinks he can say that after leaving a mark on him. But then, the rain starts to fall and they call off their battle. And he says that the rain starts and stops suddenly. And Ray gets pissed off because mushrooms are growing on his feet at that rate. And so everyone hides while Zoyudo arrives, questioning how many times he will have to cancel his duels because of the rain. He says that he would even believe if someone said that they were cursed, but Silver questions what curse that is. Then he asks if he hasn't heard the rumors. And Anchorage now remembers, saying that when Vengeance was talking about something, he said that his camp was cursed. And so, Ziato says that the weather is strange. The number of victims increases and they were set on fire. And especially in the escort squad, Jack, Boo and Rotten, everyone is hurt. And people say that they are cursed because of all this. But he says he is sure that they are not really cursed. And the temperamental climate only fueled the fire of rumors even more. But Proda thinks that the superiors won't let something like this go unnoticed. Then the dreamer questions why he's standing at the entrance anyway, and he says that he's training his senses, but he questions if in this torrential rain it will work, and Anchorage says that it's because of the torrential rain, and so Hank questions what he's doing, asking if he's trying to be a street cat, asking what this is for. But Jackson says that this isn't a bad way to train, saying that he's doing well. But then the king asks what he taught him, questioning since when he cares about his squad leader. And so Proto thinks that it's too noisy there that he can't even hear the rain. And Ren keeps yelling, while Aldine says that if he's looking for a way to train in the tent, there are some things he can do even lying down. And at that, Ragnar asks if he wants him to look at his posture again, and Ren looks at everyone's attitude, realizing that they noticed it too. And looking at everyone, he's really sure that they noticed what he noticed, looking at Proto. Meanwhile, on the superior screen, they tell the company commanders to keep their soldiers under control. They should send a scout group before winter again, asking if anyone has suggestions to fill in the gaps, and the fairy just watches and asks about the 44th squad leader. Then he wonders about the useless guy, saying that he's a bit dumb, asking if it wouldn't be good for him to hold the scouts, but the fairy says that he could bring unexpected results. But the superior asks her why she thinks that, and she says it's just a fairy's instinct. This fairy is tough. I can feel that she's no small thing, no. And with that, he goes to her, discovering that he's being sent to the scouts. And she just looks at his face, and her eyes question if he did something to irritate the company commander. He questions what he could have done to make that happen. And Zoda questions why else she would have specifically taken him. Then he remembers that time she almost pulled her sword on him. And he questions if she won't kill him because Krang left. So Hank questions if he really will, saying that he can help him get out of AC. He knows this, holding his axe, but Proto says it's not like he can use his axe on the superior like him. But he says no, would tell him to do something like that. However, Crady says it's better for him not to do that either, since he already has a history of doing such things. And Odin starts praying for the captain, asking why he tests his poor servants, telling him not to take his precious little squad leader from them. Then he wonders what's gotten into these guys, and Ragnar also gets up, saying he can go in his place, but Zankard says the others can, but not him, and everyone says that Ragnar is a bit dangerous, and he might get lost. And Jackson questions if they told him he should scout the tall grass fields, telling him to pay attention to changes in the sounds in the grass, since noticing disturbances is the first step to overcoming an ambush. And Ren gets pissed, asking if that sneaky bastard thinks he can teach him again because we already told him to stop teaching those weird things. But then, Proto says that no one will stop them from fighting after he's gone, and asks if it's right to leave them here. He thinks that he even agrees that there's no one better than him to do this, because after enlisting because of his weak skills, he was constantly moved around, replacing other people. And the only place where he ended up being useful was among those crazy people who never stop fighting among themselves and almost kill each other all the time. And he actually stops the two, saying that it was as the leader of the sober squad, and he asks them to call a truce. And with him in the middle of the two's knife, Hank questions if he is brave or stupid, and Jackson says that he should be thanking him, because otherwise he would have another hole in his heart. But Ren says that his head would have fallen off before, and the Proto thinks to himself that those damned guys really are skilled, so they can't lose him. And compared to them, he is not a big loss in combat power, and thinks that there is no need for this sudden contemplation because he knows where he is in terms of skill, and he says that he just needs to improve. So, as he goes with the scouts, he says that the scouts are going to the front line, so he can spend his time training his senses. And in that, one of them notices Anchorage walking with his eyes closed, calling him the leader of the leftover squad, telling him to focus. And he doesn't quite understand, and he says that they both may have the same squad leader ranking, but he's the leader of that scout squad. If they have any problems, then they'll solve them. And here he is, Andrew Gardner, and his friends start making fun of Proto, asking if he thinks he has the balls to fight him because he's in that squad of exiles who question even if Proto knows how to hold a sword properly. And Andrew says that if he goes up to him, of course he'll try not to hurt him, calling Proto useless, saying that the squad only works because of the members that are in it. And at that he starts yelling, saying that if they meet the enemy, they should crush their big guys. And everyone agrees, and Proto thinks that they're yelling, asking if they don't understand what recon means, thinking that the squad leader is a complete rookie and wondering if this recon mission will end well. But then one of them finds tracks over there, and he notices that those are wildebeest tracks, and they say that they will follow that track because they will have a barbecue that night. However, Proto knows very well that wildebeest travel in groups of at least 20, and he wonders if he is really going to fight against that, wondering what Andrew has in mind. And so, a guy next to him starts laughing, thinking that that is definitely not someone new, but a gazelle. Proda is next to him and says that the squad leader is kind of unpleasant. And Henry tries to be nice to him, and Proda says that he used to be a hunter in a mountain town. And Henry didn't seem to mind the squad leader. He struck up a conversation with him, and they soon became close. Henry talked about the basics of being a hunter, which he found quite useful. He says that there is usually a separate path for the animals in those fields, but he'll talk about that tomorrow. And so, already at night, they talk about how they spent the whole day looking for Guinness that didn't exist. And the day of the scout squads was wasted. And in that, Andrew still wanted to keep hunting Gino, thinking that he needs results and anything would do. And Proda just watches him lying down. And the next day, as they follow the path, they arrive at where they should be, saying that that's the place they should scout. Green Pearl, also known as AKA the useless field of grass. So he has a huge field in front of him that covers their heads. And Andrew says that they crossed that grassy field they found. But at that, Henry wonders if they're really going to go in there, asking if they weren't supposed to explore only that far. But then, Proda says that that's the squad leader's command, and follows them all. However, he says that going through those tall leaves isn't easy. So he thought he'd give up soon, but Andrew kept going, which is unexpected, and he says that he's not complaining, he's taking it seriously. And at that, Henry thinks that there aren't many animal droppings around there. So he questions if it's a problem, and Henry says that it means there are no animals in a place where food is abundant for them. But as they keep walking, Proda hears a paw, who is definitely not human, and that scares him a lot. When he looks to the side, that beast is already in front of him, passing, running. And so, when she looks at them and he looks at her, he tells everyone to get down. And Andrew has the brilliant idea of shouting that that is the enemy, telling everyone to run. But the enemy has a crossbow in his hand, attacking in a group. So several of them are caught, and Proda tries to run away last. But then he starts to get surrounded. But even running away, the enemy has crossbows that can hit him from afar. So Proda hears the noise of her being pulled and thinks that the listening technique he learned from Jackson is certainly useful, and so he manages to escape from that arrow. But he thinks that with all that noise, he can't know what the... And he thinks he's only useful while he's being shot at in every way and gets stabbed hard, dying right there. And he thinks that when you know you're going to be ambushed, the most sensible thing to do is to try to avoid it. But then, as they make another mistake on that lawn, he warns Andrew, but he questions what he said, asking if he wants him to cut his head off. So he thinks there's no way they could have heard what he said. So he goes to look for a way to do it himself. But then they realize it's an ambush, and Proda says he tried to run using a different path. But the enemies stopped him once again, and he ended up being kidnapped. Then he says he was caught by about 20 crossbowmen from the east and died after being pierced by arrows. So he kept getting killed, and he went north to avoid the crossbowmen, but he came across a squad of spearmen and ended up getting killed again. And so, during the night, he was still alive, slowly dying as he died of hatred. So, he says that even though he somehow managed to avoid everyone, they didn't stop chasing him. And little by little he sees people approaching, and he says that their uniforms are painted green, as if they were preparing for an ambush. And he wonders what there is to protect in this camp for him to be so prepared, and keeps crawling until the middle of the camp, and there he sees something that leaves him in total disbelief. But then, before he could record it in his mind, someone comes and plunges his sword into his neck, and he thinks that bastard. What are they hiding there? And once again he continues following Andrew, even though he knows what is going to happen, and he says that they have tried this dozens of times, and as soon as they enter there is no way to get out of there alive. But he says that those icemen, they're hiding something there, and he has to find out what it is. But if he gives up on that goal, he won't have to die. And then Henry notices Anchor falling behind, and he thinks that this could be the end of that today. But Proda doesn't think so, saying he won't run away from that wall, and ends up going in front of them. But Errol keeps talking shit, wondering what the useless guy is waiting for. And so, another guy says that he knows he's becoming a burden, but tells him to get used to it because his squad leader has his own difficulties too. But, example of a question, why should he do that? Saying there's a limit to how much bullshit he can tolerate from an idiot, and ask if that guy isn't also getting tired of licking the boots of that childish squad leader. He questions what Proda said, but he just pushes him out of the way, saying he won't play that game anymore. And so Andrew asks if he is saying he is going to disobey orders, and he says he needs to rethink the situation better. And he says that disobedience is intolerable, and thinks that he simply won't be able to survive alone, and tells Andrew that he will give him the orders from now on. Then he says that if he uses everyone's strength so that they can get out alive, it could work. But Andrew doesn't like that at all, and he thinks that Andrew is the one who survives the longest along with that other one, Soldier and Henry, and he thinks that especially that Soldier with the mark on his eyes fights as well as he looks. He's the most skilled in this squad, but he's always on that kid's tail. So he must be some kind of babysitter or bodyguard. And Aniru says that he might try to take control. But that's of course if he defeats him by having Prado draw his sword. And he thinks that a normal soldier wouldn't have a bodyguard. So he's obviously well-trained, playing by his posture. And he notices that Andrew has little experience, given his skill level. He must be the son of some rich lord or something. But he thinks if that were the case, he wouldn't be so desperate to get results, and thinks that he must be a disgraced noble or something. And so, Andrew says that judging by his pathetic skills and yet extremely high ranking, he must be some loser who never trained, but still expects to get paid. And Prota thinks that whatever he is, he can't keep following his orders. And so, he says that he is different from him and has a mission to fulfill. But Prota simply says that he talks too much, telling him to go ahead, since he won't even need to draw his sword, and Endigo really loses his mind, going all out. Prota thinks that normally he would have difficulty against someone as skilled as him, but he is obviously underestimating him, and his impulsive actions lead him to recklessness. And so he goes all out, stretching his sword out in front of him. And Prota simply deflects his sword, lightly slapping it to the side, making him completely lose his posture. Then he punches him in the middle of the boy's chest, making him fall completely out of breath on the ground, and they notice that he was defeated with just one blow, and Henry almost doesn't believe it because he heard that he was rock bottom. And everyone looks at Anchorage as he says that from now on that squad is under his command, asking if anyone has a problem with that, and Henry almost doesn't believe it, and that other mercenary also stays quiet while Andrew has nothing to say. And so everyone agrees, and he thinks that this is the first step. As they enter, they wonder what that bastard is thinking. But then he asks Henry what his dream is, and he questions the reason for the question. Then he says that he wants to marry a beautiful woman who works in a flower shop. So, Prota says that to do that, he will need to survive that day. And he also questions the other soldier. He says that his beloved had a baby recently, and Prota says that if he doesn't want his son to live without a father, he'll need to get out of there alive that day. Is to revive the Gardner house. Then he says that all the answers are the same, and to be able to achieve them, they all needed to get out of there alive. Then he turns his back on them, saying that everyone there will get out alive. And Prota thinks that from now on he needs for those people to be proactive. And obviously there is no greater motivation than life itself. And he says that the enemy would appear soon, and he was planning to go through with. And he speaks to Henry, telling him to shoot an arrow in that direction at head height. But Henry says there's nothing there. However, Prota says he won't do it again, telling him to shoot. And Henry actually does it, hitting an enemy soldier, killing him. So, the enemy realizes it's an ambush, and Prota's team is surprised that they're enemies. So, he calls Andrew to go after him, and he really does, and Prota says that fighting with the advantage could change everything, killing one more of those enemies, and he thinks they need to find them first, and ambush them. Come on, if Subaru had that level of wisdom, things would be very different there in ReZero. And while Prota is following all the enemies closely, they wonder what happened, asking to kill them all. But then, Andrew manages to kill that guy who was talking too much. And Prota thinks that they need to take advantage of the confusion and reduce their numbers as much as possible. But then the enemy appears behind Andrew, almost killing him, and Prota thinks that if he brings Andrew to his team, his bodyguard will follow him without hesitation. And so, that man who almost kills Andrew has his head cut off, because his bodyguard can kill him easily. And Prota thinks that with this, his chances of success are much greater, with that bodyguard on his side. So, he continues decimating the enemies, and he thinks that the enemy, who originally had 12, is now only 8 people, and everyone else keeps shouting that this is an ambush, asking for help, and he wonders how many there are, while they are all in a mess, and Prota thinks that the rest will die little by little, that they realign themselves, and Prota orders all of them to completely kill the enemy army, and they go on a rampage, and Prota says that in a field with tall grass like that, the enemies also have difficulty finding the location. But he says that they were discovered first because of that puma that is from one side to the other, but this time, even an enemy soldier gets scared by that and tries to kill the puma, already pissed off with the animal. But then Prota takes advantage of this and kills the soldier who was behind that animal. He remembers the first time he saw that animal and notices that they were chasing the beast he had seen. They were chasing and, coincidentally, they discovered it. So, This time, they didn't notice their ambush because they were focused on the hunt. And things are going well thanks to him, so he won't die easily. And so, Henry shouts to him, saying that they finally finished everyone off. And Proda says that they can't waste time, calling them to get going. But then that cat, his mother and family, keep walking behind Proda, watching. He says that after a casualty, they only have 6 left in their unit, and even after multiple cycles, it's impossible to save them all. He says that even so, this time most of them survived, and he calls for them to continue, but then a soldier appears. Proto, hearing them from afar, manages to rip his head off calmly, and says that because of the repetitions of that day, he knows the locations and number of enemy soldiers, and if they continue on that path, they will be annihilated by 30 crossbowmen. But then he calls them to turn in another direction, and he says that he needs to turn right to avoid them, and the spearmen who persistently pursued him every time he returned need to be eliminated quickly, otherwise they will hinder his movement. And he quickly kills them one by one, and he says that he wants to avoid difficult fights and use lightning ambushes to gradually escape the enemy circus, and so even Andrew manages to do a good job killing the enemies, but his guard thinks that Andrew is starting to exaggerate. Because when night falls, it will be difficult to find the exit. He says that they need to escape while the sun is still in the sky, and the protocols for them to go ahead. But then the guard asks what he's doing because this is even deeper, but he says he knows about this, saying that this is the right direction, saying that he won't accept any disagreement, asking the guard to follow him. But then both Henry and Andrew get scared and the guard puts the sword to the protagonist's telling him that he should think straight, saying that he doesn't intend to follow him to his death, and that he'll find a way to get out alive, even if he has to kill him. However, the protagonist says that soon he, of all people, should know that there's no turning back. And after the noise they made, their way back must already be full of enemies. Then he asks if he's saying that he should keep following him, and the protagonist says that he'll make that very clear, saying that he also wants to survive. And Andrew starts to notice that Proda might be different because he thought he would be a useless piece of trash like his father who gave up everything and spent all his family's fortune. But he thinks he was wrong, and in fact he reminds someone else, and he remembers his mother speaking her last words on her deathbed, saying that his family might be over, but even so he hopes that he will become someone who leads people just by being there and gaining the trust of others, becoming a leader and rebuilding his family. He thinks that this is the kind of person he always wanted to be, and Proda looks straight into the bodyguard's eye, telling him to trust him because they will get out of there alive, and Andrew thinks to himself that he is truly a man who paves the way, looking into Proda's eyes, calling him Captain Anchorage and telling him that he trusts him. My friends, I have goosebumps. This is getting too good. And the bodyguard even tries to talk to Andrew, but he says that the captain is now anchored, and the squad follows their captain's orders. Then the bodyguard notices that he has really changed, and then Proda notices that everything is fine, and he says that until he gives the signal, they must follow him crouching down without making any noise. And he thinks that the first step of the escape method that day is to take the initiative in searching for the enemy and breaking the siege. But in the second step, the pass is a little more complicated, and while they walk completely crouched down, they look to the side and several spears are there. And he says that that is the critical point that he found after dozens of repetitions. And everyone is scared, but still silent. And Proda says that it was only at that time and in that place that he felt terror. But he thinks, while he is walking around there, that they can let the enemy pass without a direct confrontation. And everyone is looking for them, but he remains completely crouched, fleeing from the confrontation with that many enemies. Then everyone starts sweating, while Proda continues to observe only with his ears, and he remains crouched with everyone there in an unbelievable tension. He says that everything is according to his plan, and now is the last step because the sun sets and darkness falls, and he says that the reason he always talks about fleeing this camp is clear, and so he says that they arrived. So Henry can't believe it, and the other one who is there thinks that after everything they have been through, they are in the enemy camp, and so he speaks to the soldier from Aspen. They are killing everyone who enters the camp to silence them. And that's because they're hiding something that no one can know about. And in the middle of that camp, there's a totally bizarre monument with several bones underneath a flag, completely shredded, and Proda wonders what will happen when something more important than capturing them happens, and he calls everyone to go, and thinks that a way to escape is sure to. An ISA will show up, and in that, while they sneak behind some tents, they ask Proda if he's going to burn down the enemy camp, and the bodyguard asks if he's gone crazy, because they're in the middle of the camp, and it's more likely that they'll end up surrounded and dead. But in that, he asks what that bodyguard's name is, and he says he can call him Mac. So, Proda says he won't tolerate disobedience, and he even tries to complain, but Andrew tells Mac to shut up, and so Proda follows closely, and Mac continues pissed, saying that he doesn't need Enro to tell him, that they won't be able to get out of there with the moon behind the clouds, saying that in a situation like that, they can't trust anyone other than their squad leader. And so, he cuts one of the tents, but Mac wonders what the hell he's doing, wondering if he's tearing the tent to get through. But then, he notices that the tent is empty, and Mac continues to find that very strange, wondering how he knows these things. And so, Prota continues calmly, going on his way at full speed. So, Mac thinks he's very reckless going through the enemy camp, but he thinks that, strangely, even though he did that, they didn't see any of their soldiers. And he says that, stopping to think about it, without a shadow of a doubt, they are in the enemy camp. So, he wonders how that is possible. And with that, Prota tells them to stop, asking them to wait there. And he thinks that he has infiltrated that camp dozens of times. And the first time he noticed that flag and touched it, the attention of the entire base turned to him and he ended up being killed very calmly. And he says that what Aspen's soldiers wanted to hide in that bush is that flag and their main objective is to protect it. And he wonders what will happen if it catches fire, and Mark then wonders if he already knew that the flag was there, but how. Then Mark assumes that the company commander told him, remembering that it was her. But she indicated that they are nobodies and thinks that there must be a reason for this. And Prota says that Aspen's soldiers will be too busy protecting the flag. So, Mike continues to think that the reason he took control of the Nowhere Squad and infiltrated that enemy camp was all to complete a secret mission. But that's still just a guess. And Prota says that they will flee while this happens. And he says that they will separate into two groups. One group will be the bait drawing the enemy's attention, and the other will start a fire. And so Max says he will go with the bait group. So he's in doubt about it, thinking that he was complaining the whole time, but he suddenly became cooperative. But he thinks that this is better for him, and says that he's dragged the squad to Camp Aspen several times. However, this is the first time he's had so many people with him. And this is the best today he's had so far. He thinks he has a good feeling. And the battle starts first with an arrow, then Mac takes the lead, running, drawing the attention of the enemies, and they all aim at him while Prota goes to a candelabra and grabs a flame, saying that he's going towards tomorrow. But as he grabs that flame, a man appears next to him, swinging his sword at Prota, but doesn't hit him, just cutting the candelabra and taking the fire from his hand. So he thinks he didn't hear him coming. And that man stands face to face with the protagonist as he prepares to leave. And he notices that this is an enemy fighter that he hasn't seen in any of his others today. And the man seems to be quite the badass as he stands in front of the protagonist. And he asks where someone as strong as him came from. Then the man calls the protagonist a worm, but in that he says that they were late. Then that guy finally notices that the tent next to him is on fire, and everyone screams saying that the tents are on fire as they notice that there are intruders, and the protagonist's group runs. A barrel in his arm, and that man who was in front of the protagonist tells everyone to put out the fire first, and Anchorage thinks that Mac attracted most of the enemies and he got the attention of the rest in that time Andrew set the tents on fire. He thinks he just needs to escape from that place now, but then he goes against his mind, taking a step forward, thinking that all attacks start with the foot. Stopping a thrust, aiming at the man in front of him, thinking that he should kick the ground to propel his body forward, saying that he can see the attack he will be able to give that man, but as the sword gets close to him, he manages to quickly turn his eyes and escape. Stop that attack, and the protagonist doesn't hit him, passing directly by him. Then Anchorage is shocked, because he hit him in the meantime, and the pain in the side of his body makes him start to limp, while the man is calm after having hit him, and Anchorage thinks that this was the most perfect thrust he could make, looking at the man behind him as he says that Prota is weak. So he thinks he can't defeat him, and he won't be able to defeat him with his current level of skill. Then he thinks he barely made it there through countless deaths, ambushes in the field, and everything he went through until then. He says he thought he had finally defeated the challenges that today had to offer him, but he realizes that the real wall he has to break is that guy. And with that pain in the side of his abdomen, he says that he will end up dying, without further ado if he challenges him. So he will need to take control of the squad again, escape through the fields and repeat today countless times in the process, and then die all those meaningless deaths. Then the man in front of him looks at Prota, who is all hurt, but then he gets angry, asking if he's laughing, and Anchorage really is, thinking he's still going to finish him off. Then that man says he's going to cut him and feed him to the dogs, and Prota keeps thinking he's going to overcome that wall. While Prota is on the knight, he easily stops the attack, and Prota notices that he parried his attack, and is about to launch another one, but Anchor gets out of the way in time. The knight has such good mastery that he continues a sequence of attacks, putting a lot of pressure on Prota, and he is surprised that he attacked from above in that position and almost takes another sword strike, but manages to stop it in front of his eyes and notices that his movements are fast and precise. And the man has blood in his eyes, and Anchorage thinks he can't find any opening to counterattack, noticing that that is a very big difference in skill, and so he is thrown away again. But while he is falling backwards, he takes a dagger from his chest and throws it at that guy. However, the knight manages to stop it using his glove easily. He notices that he stopped it with back of his hand, and the knight with a lot of hatred prepares to attack Prota again, and this time he uses a thrust while they scream that the fire is spreading, and Prota manages to dodge that attack by a very small margin. Meanwhile, the enemy soldiers are putting out that fire in the middle of the path and notice that someone is throwing oil there. So the fire goes up to that flag. And at that maestro they were defending, and they shout at the commander of the platoon that was attacking Prota, asking if he doesn't understand what's at stake. But he looks at Anchorage, noticing by the look on his face that he won't give up without a fight, and he's ready to attack once more. Then the commander talks to him, telling him that he'll wait for the next one. And so Ingrid notices that he's retreating so easily that she wonders if he wasn't the real wall, but then he thinks he wasn't, saying that if he's not the wall that he'll need to overcome today, he still needs to improve. And with that, Andrew runs up to Prota, saying that they need to go now, but Anchorage keeps looking at that squad commander as he goes into the fire, and he looks back at Prota eye to eye. Then he puts away his sword and tells everyone to retreat. And so they all run off after finishing what they came to do. As Prota runs, he looks to the side and notices that one of the guys who went that way has disappeared, noticing that there are only 5 members of the squad left now. So Mac asks if that's it, asking if they won't send a large-scale pursuit group after them. But Prota says that it's likely not. However, as they run, he notices Henry falling behind, because his arm is apparently injured, and some soldiers go after them, telling them not to let them escape. And Henry, who is behind delaying the group, continues to get slower and slower without needing to say a single word. Both Max, Anchor, and Andrew return to stay and battle those who are chasing them, and they all begin the widespread slaughter. So he tells them not to stop and to keep running, carrying Henry in his arms. And he says that they won't be able to chase him if they continue through the fox and snake's field habitat. But his friend says that this also means that it will be harder for them to escape there too. However, Henry says that he knows a safe route, a hunter's path, and so Incrode says that he will trust him, telling him to guide them. And a while later, he says that he is no longer hearing the footsteps of the group he was chasing. So they keep running until a fox looks after them, and while they continue desperate, the protagonist says that thanks to Andrew and Max's efforts, they managed to lose them easily, and if it were Henry's way, they wouldn't have been able to lose them so quickly. He says that it was thanks to the efforts of the entire squadron that they got this far. Then he notices the sky breaking brightly once again. And so he realizes that this day has finally come to an end, and after running through a long field, they finally arrive at their camp. Then they ask what happened to them, but they just want to faint. And Prota feels that wind, thinking that another today has passed and a new day begins. Meanwhile, in the enemy camp, all those flags are completely burned, and the commander asks about them. And that guy who looks like a wizard says that they need to prepare them again, because who would have imagined that the famous Grey wouldn't be able to stop a few mongrels. And he thinks to himself that he really doesn't understand, because soldiers camped in the tall grass fields were the best of the Grey Dog. But a few enemy soldiers attacked head-on, started a fire, and escaped. And he talks about the Grey Dog, which is an independent company with independent operational control. And the name of the company is derived from the Grey Dog that resides in the Principality of Aspen. They say that having a persistent temperament, he has the need to connect with whatever target he decides on, be it in love or in war. Helen says that this company named Grey Dog are also called persistent lovers, and so he talks to a guy who fought against Prota, asking if the person he faced was strong, talking to the platoon commander Mid, and he says that if it weren't for the fire, he would have finished him off on the spot. And so, the Conscious then thinks he was lucky, saying that this is already a skill in itself. But Mitch says that this will not happen again. However, in the meantime, Prota thinks that what bothers him is that he faced that wall but could not overcome it, thinking that he wanted to keep fighting him, and soon, eventually, they will have to face each other again, and Mitch says that he will kill him with his own hands, while Prota thinks that he will overcome him too. And so it is said that the persistent lovers have chosen their next target. Meanwhile, the king is in the tent literally throwing his axe in the air, thinking that he is bored, thinking that the squad leader must be returning from the reconnaissance mission, wondering why there's no news from him, and so he picks up the axe, wondering if he died, thinking that he really improved a lot recently, but he's still a rookie, so it wouldn't be surprising if he did. Saying that it doesn't happen often, but he really liked him, and thinks that he could do if he's dead, thinking that there's nothing interesting. Then Ragna wakes up and bumps into Hank and is looking at him with a face like he found something to play with. And Ragna questions what that he's looking at, and he just gives him the finger, and Ragna gives him the finger back using his foot. Dude, I need to learn how to do that. And Ren finds something that will get him out of his boredom by telling Ragna that he really wants to kill him, and Ragna calls him crazy and pulls out his sword. Meanwhile, the company commander asks him if by chance he discovered that there was an enemy ambush, infiltrated an enemy base while he was there, and also, by chance, ended up burning down the entire place. And he says that he continued to make the best possible decisions in that situation and was lucky. Then she thinks about this luck looking into his eyes, and she ends up just accepting it, telling him to rest and recover. And she thinks that she kind of expected that this would achieve something, but she didn't expect something this big, wondering who that final guy is. And Prota thinks to himself that he really can't understand what she's thinking. And with that, Andrew goes to him, saying that he's sorry for having acted badly in the beginning, saying that he's alive thanks to him, asking if he will meet him again, and Prota says he will if their paths cross again, leaving, and in that the boy just pays respect to Anchorage as he leaves, but Prota tells himself that he is alive and he managed to bring back those four. But he questions himself if this is really his best, since he ended up losing 2 members of his squad. And if he were a little stronger, he could have saved him too. And with the repetition of that today, he is able to overcome his limits, and eventually he will end his desperate fight and strive to achieve his goal of becoming a knight, and will use his todays as steps for that purpose and to avoid repeating the same day over and over again. He needs to become stronger. As he returns to his company, he hears people screaming that those crazy people are at it again, and Run and Hagen are fighting again. And Run is pretty excited about it, and Ragna too. Then, Prota thinks he's never seen those expressions, saying he's trained with them countless times, but he's never seen them like that. Then, one of them says they're not even human, saying they're more like animals and they keep fighting each other as a whole, and Prota realizes they've never had to try their best against him, and he starts to think he needs to establish his priorities, and first he needs to make them make those expressions in front of him too. While fighting, Ragna ends up looking to the side, noticing that the squad leader is there, and Haim says he has to inform them if he's back, questioning why he's hiding like a cat again. So I ask what they're looking at, saying that if they're not going to fight, he should get out. And Ragnar also notices that he is hurt, but he says it is just a scratch. And besides that, he talks to Ren, saying that when he blocked Ragnar's attack just now, but while he was going to talk, Ren says that he is already starting his antics again, telling him to just wash up and rest a little. He tries to talk to Ragnar about his attack too, but he plays dumb and just leaves. Then Prota wonders why. Malhagra doesn't say anything and just leaves there. Then Prota notices that it seems he had something to say, but he thinks he can say it if he wants. And sometime later Prota says that the battalion commander, after learning of the enemy force's ambush, he moved the entire battalion closer to the tall grass field, and his wounds healed significantly during the journey, and he constantly reflected on his fights and trained. And even at night, he prepares to train more, and Zoido smiles, surprised, saying that they will go out again tomorrow. Then he asks why he doesn't rest a little, and Prota says that he will go out for a while, and Ren says that he is doing this without being fully healed, and if he continues like this he will die soon. And Ragna also notices that something is wrong with Prota, and when he wakes up in the morning, he notices that the squad leader is training again, waking up early. As he picks up his weapon, he thinks that he is good with a sword, thinking that getting stronger was not difficult, and he had a chance to become a knight, but he thinks it's boring, saying there's nothing he wants to do as a knight, so why would he waste time and energy on it? And he says he doesn't find any meaning in it, and so he lost his purpose, and he stood still. But then, as he watches Prota training, Enkid ends up feeling his wound, and so he stops and drops his sword. And Ragnar looks at him, thinks he learned the fundamentals all wrong, and he needs to learn the fundamentals correctly when he starts, and he thinks that with all the shortcuts Prota uses to compensate for his bad fundamentals, it will be impossible for him to get stronger, but even then, with training. He wonders why he puts his whole body and effort so much. And looking at Prota, he questions why he does all this. So, Enkid says that because he wants to get stronger, and Ragnar asks him what he's going to do when he gets stronger, and Prota says that he's going to become a knight, but Ragnar says that a knight is just someone who fights well, asking if that really. It has so much meaning to him, but Anchorage says that the knight he aspires to be is someone who decides for himself what's right and raises his sword for honor, for the sick and the poor and for those he loves. So Ragnar, looking at that, thinks about honor and merit, wondering if it really is, saying that strength is just a tool, wondering if a knight is even a sword, and he thinks what he wants. So he picks up his sword and starts walking towards Prota, saying that he won't know until he walks the path himself. So he calls Anchorage asking if he wants to learn how to use the sword. Man, I really like that everyone at Prota's camp doesn't seem to care much about him, but everyone cares about the guy, besides it being a camp of absurdly strong people. And Anchored, with that invitation of his, says that he definitely wants to learn. And so, Ragnar thinks that he shouldn't have said that because he's getting lazy. But then, even so, he thinks that that look might mean that this is going to be interesting. And Ragnar says that the barbarian taught him about the beast's instinct or something like that. Then he says that it's the heart of the beast. And Ragnar says that he also has the thrust, saying that he needs to forget everything except those two things. He questions whether he has to forget even Valen's mercenary sword technique, and Ragnar says that he needs to forget that mainly because if he doesn't abandon it, even if he learns a new technique, he will end up going back to his old habits. And if that happens, he can give up and tells him to choose whether he will forget everything or stay the same. But Anchorage doesn't even let him finish the sentence, saying that he will start from scratch. Then Ragnar is surprised by this, asking if it is serious. Then he asks where to start, and Ragnar says that this guy is definitely not normal. Then he says that he has a good physique, so there is no need to have a light weapon, and a long sword would suit him well. He tells him to change, and Prota asks if it is okay if he gives him his sword. Yes. And he says it doesn't matter, saying there's nothing special about it, telling him to hold it with his right hand above his left. But when Prota holds the sword, Ragnar questions why he's squeezing it so tight, and he says it's so he doesn't lose the sword. But then Ragnar questions who taught him that, and he says it was the king. Ragnar calls that Saru totally knight, telling him to just stay in position, coming down there, sword on top of Prota, and he quickly puts the sword in front of him to defend himself. But then Ankit's hand starts to shake. He questions what was that because it hurt, and Ragnar says he should, saying that if he stays stiff, he'll only end up breaking and he's practically like a branch or a column, something like that. But he wonders why all the members of his squad are so bad at talking. Wondering what the hell he means by that comparison. Wondering if he means he's too stiff because he's holding his sword too tightly. Realizing he must mean he needs to be flexible to avoid his sword breaking, and his movements need to be more malleable, and so he starts holding his sword a little more calmly. Then Ragnar goes after him, telling him not to lose his balance, and also questions when he comes back behind where he's pointing his feet, saying he's stiff again, questioning if he wants to break his hip or if he's fighting or dancing, and so they continue and he ends up on the ground. With Ragnar beating him, he thinks he had no idea it was that bad, since he doesn't even know the basics properly, saying that this isn't something that can be taught. But then Prota, even though tired, grabs his sword and stands up, looking Ragnar in the eyes, calling him to train again. He goes after him, saying that they're gonna take it easy, and then Rin arrives saying that he was wondering where they were all day, asking if they're having a picnic with snacks and everything, and he asks Proto if that knight is giving him trouble, asking if he wants him to take care of him. And Ragnar starts saying that he's gonna rip his hands off. But then he asks if something happened and why he's dressed like that. And Ren says that it's because they were called, and they say that enemy forces are gathering on the horizon. And a few moments later, the fairy is already in an elevated position, looking at the entire army. And Prota's group is gathered, so Ren wonders if teaching him the art of the sword was a mistake, saying that he is new to this technique, so he probably won't be able to fight very well, and because of that, it is likely that he will die that day, so he raises his sword, thinking that Prota will need a babysitter. Meanwhile, Anchored thinks that he wanted to continue learning more of that technique, so they wonder why everyone is standing still, thinking that that formation is strange. And so that frayed flag continues to be raised on the opposing side, and they say that that formation is strange, and so that wizard on their side simply raises his hand, telling them to witness the end. Then, a mist begins to appear and the fairy notices that it is magic. So, that mist goes over Prota's army and he realizes that that mist appeared out of nowhere and he can't even see who is on his side. And in the middle of all that mist, they wonder what is happening. And Prota sharpens his ears more and more. Then, they start to hear some strange noises. And they wonder what that noise is, noticing that something is happening up there. So, Prota shouts to them that they are arrows, but too late because several of them are killed by them. Meanwhile, the fairy starts to use her wind powers or whatever she is using, and says that this is not a normal mist, saying that there was no way to predict that they would use it, would give a tactic like that, so she orders everyone to cover themselves by raising their shields. She notices that they lost, and the wizard starts to laugh, saying that it was very complicated to do that magic right, and he had to offer the blood of several animals, collect the cleanest water from the lakes, and use rain magic constantly. And the moment the magic is activated, it obscures all vision, unless the person is below the point where the magic was cast on the flags and that battle is already over. He calls it the fog of annihilation. Then Mitch comes behind him saying that he seems quite happy, and he says that of course because he barely managed to make it work, especially with the flag practically burned. And if it weren't for that, it would have been easy to do that, and Mitch continues totally pissed, noting that it didn't work. That guy must be on the other side. And then, with the arrows coming, someone tells the squad leader to keep his head down. He notices that the one behind him is Hag. And next to him, they notice that it's a spell. Yes, I won't call it magic anymore, because from now on there will be a distinction between magic and spell. So this one will be called a spell. This mist is a spell. And so he starts cursing. And Proto notices that Kelly is Ren's voice, saying that he's right in front of him, but he can't identify it. He just looks, thinking that he can't fight like this. He almost gets hit by a weapon and thinks that his breathing is getting heavy and he's starting to tense up, and his legs don't want to move, saying that this way he won't be able to use anything Ragnar taught him. Then he thinks that he didn't expect to get it on his first try. And Ragnar warned him that, for now, he'll end up going back to his old ways, even if he learns from him, so it would be better for Protonon to fight. Until he finishes learning what he's teaching him. But he says that he'll end up dying unless he fights on the battlefield. And Proto thinks about it, thinking about his death, and then starts walking. But then, Ragnar comes close to him, telling him to stay behind him. However, Proto says that he found a way, and says that if he doesn't get it on one try, he can go to the next one. I meet the enemy team, so I ask him if he's crazy, and he ends up being killed in front of everyone, and he ends up being stabbed right in the throat by an enemy soldier, and he's happy to have killed him, but Proto thinks that with this he'll go back to learn from Ragnar, and the soldier almost doesn't believe in that guy who jumped on his own spear, and ends up taking Proto out, and so he goes back, and already in the middle of the training he continues to give his all, while thinking that, to be honest, Ragnar isn't a great teacher, and Proto says that for him, who is a genius, everything is too obvious, and it ends up being difficult for him to put into words what's wrong. And Ragnar wonders if this is what they mean when someone understands something but can't put it into practice, saying that they're just asking him to swing his sword down and asking if it's that hard. And Anchorage knows he's not slamming, he's really confused. But then, Proto asks him where his center of gravity should be. However, Ragnar has an absurd difficulty showing him where it is. And Proto thinks that, as he imagined, people like him have no idea how to do what they do, and he thinks that Ragnar's explanations are vague, but observing and listening are one of his strengths, and he'll remember his posture. It doesn't matter how many times he needs to, and so he comes back every time, thinking that he's still too stiff, and so he lets himself die, saying that it's okay because he can die and keep learning, and so, as he comes back, he gets better and better. And that's the 31st day, and now he's able to move flexibly. And Ragnar notices that that step he took was very good, asking where he learned it, saying that he should already be able to start learning the basics. Then Ragnar says that the 3 basic attacks of a sword are cutting, thrusting, and slicing, and he tells Anchorage to use the tip of the blade to defend himself. And if the sword is of good quality, he can use the sides as well. And he points the sword in the direction of the protagonist, saying that the shortest distance between him and his opponent is called the line of attack. And the use of the sword is all about blocking your opponent's line while extending your own. He must draw his opponent in his head and reach him with his sword. And so, as that spearman comes at him trying to kill him, they pierce him with 3 spears, so he thinks that little by little his today begins to change. And he begins to face Ragnar with a little more ease, and he himself is surprised that he stopped her, asking if he predicted his sword. And so Proto goes just a little bit at a time, dying, coming back, and getting better and better. And Ragnar says that he doesn't need to practice that diagonal strike anymore. Yes, even with that little bit, as he goes, he keeps dying and coming back to create constant progress. And so, Ragnar starts to take the fight he's having with Proto quite seriously, to the point where he really has to give it his all. And so he becomes more and more shocked, asking who that is in front of him. My friends, if this isn't a movie, you can get up from that chair and leave, bro. Because I bought the wrong ticket. And already on the battlefield, covered in snow, Anchorage says he thought he couldn't evolve much more with his talent. But then Ragnar calls him back, telling him Proto moves on once more, saying he's surpassed his previous level, and so he can dodge the spears more easily, and so he thinks his ultimate goal is still the path to becoming a knight, and he walks through all those soldiers. And ends up being killed once again, but then he starts to smile, saying that there is more to that pain, and he thinks that this is fun with a totally psychopathic look as he dies. Because it's so fun that he could go crazy. I'll be honest with you, going crazy is the least of his problems. And then, Ragnar goes to him, asking if he wants to learn the art of the sword once more. So, Prota thinks that if he can get stronger, he says that he will die as many times as necessary. While Ragnar goes back to training, he finds something strange, saying that it's not possible that the squad is so good, asking if he's been fighting like a fool on purpose until now. But he says that's not quite the case. Then Ragnar says that he has a very good base, and if it seems like he needs anything, it's experience. And so he starts going back to that battlefield, and he says that he has repeated that today more than 200 times so far, and he follows it towards the arrows, leaving in the middle of all the enemies. Then he says that he will see how far the techniques he learned will take him, and he goes on a path of death ripping off heads. And he says that he knows where the enemies will appear behind the fog, and ends up killing them quite easily, even throwing Kanes, saying that he can finish off some of them even if he can't see them. So they wonder who that is, while Prota follows through the fog, knowing exactly where they are, but they can't see him. Then one of them wonders if there is anyone there, but ends up losing his leg without even knowing where the attack came from. While Prota finishes that guy off, the enemy army starts to go into an uproar, wondering what's going on there, asking everyone to be careful with the ground, and one of them even points the crossbow downwards. And he remembers Ragnar, telling him to remember his eyes, feet and hands, telling him to observe with his eyes, anticipate moving with his feet and then act with his hands. And Prota becomes more and more psychopathic, transforming into the Madarino in the middle of the field. And he thinks it's different, saying that the feeling is completely different compared to when he had no idea of the principles. So he wants more and more, asking everyone to come to him. Then he gets to a certain point where several crossbows are pointing at his body. Then the soldier says he did well by filtering himself there, but questions if he really thinks he'll make it alive. However, Prota simply looks at them, saying that what he wants is to fight with swords, and calls them to fight like that, saying that he wants to fight like men. So he keeps wanting to keep testing himself, but they obviously don't fall for this cheap provocation, taking it away with their kisses and piercings. Prota totally. And so, in the astral plane, Sharon says that he walked to his own grave and must have lost his own mind. And so, Prota wakes up again, wondering what happened, because that appeared out of nowhere to offend him. Thinks that he really just went there to offend him and left. But Dinas questions what he's doing in the moon world, and Rin looks at him and he remembers the moment when Rin said that it was a spell, and he thinks about the enemy formation completely broken from a tactical point of view. He says it looked like they were guarding the flag like on a battlefield, but he wonders why. So he asks Rempa, asking if he knows anything about spells, and he questions why this question out of the blue, and Prota says that's all, that he thought it would be interesting, asking him to tell what he knows. But then, Rin wonders if he knows the difference between magic and spells. So he says that magic is more common, but Ren says that's not wrong. However, a spell needs a medium, and not only does it need one, but the medium is much more important. And spells cannot exist without a medium, and Prota thinks that's it, saying that the fog is a spell from the enemies, and that flag was the medium. In other words, if you break the flag, the fog will dissipate. Then he asks if his tribe uses spells, saying that spells originate from the east, and Run is from the western border, and Rin says he's seen it, questioning if he didn't know that there are many real sorcerers, saying that most of them are actually wizards. And so Prota simply leaves the tent and asks again where he's going. And Prota says he's going to train. And once again he goes back to Ragna, and he says that luckily it seems that they both have the same basic training. And he talks about the Oniaki sword technique, asking if he knows anything about it. And so the Prota tells of a prodigy in 1,000,000 years ago. The child, born on a sword farm, killed 12 bandits who attacked the farm, and with nothing but a fire. And because having lost his parents early, he learned the art of the sword at a young age, and a nobleman who had heard the rumors adopted him, and that prodigy was named Leon Zisoniac. However, as much as he was blessed, he was cursed, and he began to lose his strength at the age of 10, and was completely paralyzed by the age of 12. And thus the prodigy of the Misty Runes was lost to history. But Ragnar tells of a 20-year-old Leonidas, completely paralyzed, immortalizing himself in the history of swordsmanship. He compiled all the sword techniques on Earth and categorized them into 5 categories. They were the fair and elaborate sword art, the strong and heavy sword art, the fluid and disoriented sword art, the fast and inconsistent sword art, and the gentle and deflecting sword art. thinks about Oniaki's technique, and he says that Leones rewrote the history of the sword, and with that the Oniaki family became the greatest house in the empire, and the effects of this technique can still be felt in the foundations of sword techniques today. And Ragnar talks about all the sword arts and, additionally, the art of the sword here in the East. He says that, among these, the technique he developed has roots in the art of the heavy sword of the North, so he asks about the consciousness of the beast, and Proto corrects him again, saying that it is the heart, and he says that that should be more useful, telling him to concentrate on a single point, forgetting everything around him and focusing only on his own sword and its enemies. Then he says he will show him what it is like. Then he simply raises his sword and attacks Proto without him even seeing that the sword is so fast that it passes by, makes a wood on Proto's neck, and he only notices later, noticing that it is a faster blow than Ren's axe, saying that he almost died. Then, Ragnar asks if he felt something, however, Ren appears there cursing Ragnar, questioning if he is trying to kill the squad leader, but he says that people concentrate better on the verge of death, that he is only helping him. However, Ren says that he will not be able to learn anything if he is without his head, asking if he knows how long it took him to learn the heart of the beast. However, Ragnar says that this is expected since he has a stupid barbarian teaching him. So, they start arguing again, and Proto thinks that they both are horrible at teaching, and Ren says that he is from the far north. He questions whether Ragnar's people aren't more barbaric than everyone else, but then Ragnar says he's from the southern barbarian tribes. And Ren starts to want to pick a fight, but Proto says that's enough, questioning whether Ren isn't there because of the order to retreat, and Ragnar tells him to remember how alert he is moments before death. Because if he is successful in concentrating on a single point, everything around him disappears and he will feel his sword doing its part. So, on the battlefield, he thinks it's similar to the heart of the beast, yet completely different. And he thinks that the heart of the beast will make you lose yourself in the face of death. But concentrating on a point makes you more alert. And he says he needs more experience to recalibrate himself. He keeps thinking about the flag, which is the medium of the spell. Then he starts to aim, saying he needs to get rid of that flag to escape that carnage. And so, with that fog, everyone goes blind again. And Proto says he's going to set a new objective above gaining experience, saying he's going to destroy the flag. So he keeps going forward, saying it'll be easy to get there with the king and Ragnar, and keeps killing his opponents. However, he starts to think that first he'll try until he can't anymore. The crazy guy is completely unafraid of death. Overconfident. I want to see the little power fail, you won't come back. He plays around a lot, and he thinks that focusing on a single point is very useful, because he died several times while he was unprepared. And to survive the assassin, he trained his ears. And to survive the battlefield, he seized the beast's heart, but concentrating on a single point was something else. So Ragnar took his sword to the tip of Proto's nose and asks if he understood, saying that if he can, he should be able to feel the tip of the blade slowing down or something. But Proto thinks he doesn't understand, questioning if it's the boldness of the beast's heart interfering with it. But he doesn't think it is, and Ragnar says that he should feel everything around him disappear, unless the opponent's sword is able to predict the sword's path, asking if he hasn't felt anything like that yet. And Proto starts to think that analyzing the dream of death isn't the right thing to do. But Proto asks how he learned that. If Ragnar asks how to learn what, after all he's always been able to do that, then Proto seriously questions himself, and he says it's in the name, because he only needs to focus on a single point. But Proto says he won't get any useful answer from Ragnar, saying he'll have to find out on his own, telling him not to get impatient, and so he says he'll keep practicing focusing on a single point, but his priority is to take down the flag and minimize the damage to his allies, besides penetrating the enemy lines. And the moment the fog reaches all of them, Proto yells for everyone to get on the ground, telling them to raise their shields. And so they manage to stop most of the arrows that are coming, so he thinks he's repeated that day 300 times and knows where the attacks will come from with his eyes closed. As he passes, he kills enemy after enemy, making a line of corpses. Then all the charge at him trying to get him, but the protagonist is being absurd, destroying everyone and really focusing on a single point. And so they order them to maintain their positions, telling them to stop that crazy piece of shit. But the protagonist keeps smiling and advancing forward, killing a lot and becoming more and more like both Run and Ragnar in their berserker way of being. As he continues forward, the soldiers disappear, and he tells himself that it took 10 today for him to get to the flag. But when he knocks it down, he notices something strange, saying that he is sure he destroyed it, but he wonders why the mist is still there, and so he ends up dying. Then the soldiers think, which seems like he knows a little about spells, but he says he was mistaken, and Proto thinks that's it, saying that there is only one true flag, and the others are just distractions, saying that he needs to find the real one among them. And so, While he does that, he keeps trying to advance alone through everyone. He thinks he has 5 chances to get it right on the next try and tells everyone to get down on the ground and use their shields. And he ends up defending himself, but many die. And he wonders why they didn't listen to him like last time, wondering if it's time, because maybe he needs to give them time to recover. And he manages to knock down the second flag after passing 3 today. And the other one was the copy, and there are 4 left. And so he spends another 5 days to be able to take down the third flag, and it was another copy. And for the 4th flag, it took him 7 days to get there. But it was the same, also being a copy, and he thinks he only has 2 more. However, when he looks at them, he feels that the one with a burned part is the real flag. Besides, it is the one that is the furthest away, and also close to that call. And so Proda, as soon as the snow comes, orders them to get down to the ground and use their shields. And everyone hears him protecting himself from the arrows. And so Ragna questions if he has gone crazy, and Proda thinks that she is positioned far away from him, so he can't get tired until he reaches the barrier, and he leaves taking Ren with him, saying that he will let him draw the attention of the enemies, and take the opportunity to get past them, and Ren in turn grabs one of the enemies, questioning who it was that cast the spell, but he thinks that he won't talk, saying that he waits for the next one to talk, and Proda continues forward, saying that the equivalent of a year has passed repeating that day, and he finally reaches the flag, thinking that it will be the end. But then, as he throws his sword is stopped by Mitch, who throws his hand away. So he says that this seems like a dream because God answered his prayers. And Missy says that she really wanted him to kill with his own hands, but Proda simply plays Thanos, saying that he doesn't even know who he is. And then the poor guy is left in disbelief that Proda forgot about him in the few days that passed. But Proda still doesn't remember at all. Then the guy says he'll remember when he cuts him, and he goes after him. But Proda manages to get out of the way and counterattack quickly. Then Mid is surprised, wondering if it's the same guy he saw before, saying he's gotten incomparably better, asking if he's trying to catch up with just 1 step. And so Proda goes after him again. And Mitch thinks he's loyal to the basic eyes, that he's using the righteous sword technique, so he says he's mixing it with the fluid sword technique, to which the flat attacks and Mitch throws him back once more, but Proda attacks him again. Then Mitch thinks he needs to focus all his senses in front of him, because if he gets distracted for even a moment, his balance will collapse. He thinks he needs to throw everything in front of him. And Proda thinks he must forget the flag, the result, and the sword techniques. Everything around him must disappear, leaving only the sword, and he manages to deflect Mitch's attack head-on. But as he begins to realize what he just did, Mitch manages to pierce him, killing him. Then Proda says he remembers him, saying he was protecting the maestro there in the field, and he says he is Myth Ruria, saying he is the commander of the pilot of the Grey Dog Squadron, from the Principality of Asp. Then he says he is the commander of the squadron of the King of Deno Lilia, Anchorage, and so one of Myth's soldiers asks if he is an enemy, and he says yes, saying he's that Grey specialist, Hyde. But in that they say he seems harmless, but then Mitch looks at him, asking what's gotten into him, asking why he's smiling, so Proda thinks that Ragnar, that crazy bastard, it wasn't the concentration that comes before the fear of death that he needed. What he needed was a good rival, an opponent who would risk and give everything to fight and encourage. And Mitch wonders if he was just a fucking crazy and takes the sword out of his chest. And so Proda goes back to Ragna and he keeps talking about concentrating on a single point, saying that it's similar to the nervous feeling you get when you're dying. And Proda starts to understand. But then Ragna questions why he feels like he's not listening, asking if he's already giving up. And so Run says that they've been called. And Froda simply calls Ragna, and he thinks that, in fact, he seems even more excited, saying that he really is a weirdo, wondering if today he should take it a little harder with the warm-up. And so, after their fight, they return to that fog where Proda orders them to get down to the ground and put on their shields. And so he defends himself, and so Run tries to talk to him, but Proda simply calls him to follow him, and so he questions what the hell he's doing, and Ragnar says that if he's not going, he'll go with him, and so the king asks what's gotten into him. He asked if he took an arrow to the head, but he says that if he doesn't want to take an arrow, he should look ahead. And so Prada is killing everyone while the two follow him. And he says that they open the way in a similar way to the previous one, and meet Mitch Rurier once again, and he does so, approaching him, saying that it's great to see him, calling him to fight. Then Mitch asks if he came to meet him, and he asks if there's a problem, asking if it's the first time someone confesses to him, saying that he went there because it was love at first sight. And in that, Mitch says that his squad are the Grey Dogs, the persistent lovers, saying that it's the first time someone comes after him. So he asks if he was upset, but Mitch says that he wasn't even a little bit falling for him. And Proda thinks that entering the state of concentration, in which he can only feel the sword once more, it won't be so easy, and he ends up dying again. And so, Mitch says that he lost too easily and says that he doesn't know that he believed to come at him like that. And Prota says that his attitude was wrong, saying that it can't be intentional, saying that he needs to be involved in the fight. And he keeps repeating this to discover that feeling. And Nocta the 10th time when he goes at Mitch, he can see it once more, saying that in the 28th, he learned to enter intentionally, in a state of concentration, and in the 48th, he goes back to Ragna, who starts to teach him the tricks. And so, while his sword comes up, trying to make that cut on the side of Prota's neck, he manages to simply deflect Ragna's sword, and that certainly makes him scratch his head. He wonders how he deflected using the concentrate on one point, and Prota thinks that it is pure concentration, and it means completely controlling his body and sword, and his strength and technique develop to a point where he can no longer compare them to before he was repeating that order. And at that Ragnar calls him asking where he is going, so he says that he is going to meet with Commander Platon and says that it is time to overcome that today. I don't know if I am tripping, but this picture of Prota, it looks very much like a guy saying that he is going to win. And at that he goes to the fairy. She is surprised that he wants to see her, asking what happened. Then he talks about spells, saying that he remembered seeing them during the reconnaissance. And she doesn't quite understand. And he says that Aspen soldiers were calling a strange man a sorcerer. So she tells him to elaborate. And he says he told her everything she needed to win the battle. And so, when Nelva arrives, everyone goes to the ground and uses their shields. And he says he just hopes his commanders are competent. And he says what he needs to do now is go to Mitch. He's really going to beat that guy. And when Mitch sees him, he gets pissed off, and Prota calls him by name. He's surprised that he knows his identity, and Prota says he wanted to fight him from the beginning, saying he's going to defeat him, going all out. But Mitch also gives Prota a lot of trouble, but he can defend himself much better from his attacks. And Mid is surprised that he's improved so much, giving him trouble, making him sweat. As they exchange attacks, Mid asks if he was hiding his abilities, and Prota says that apparently he was. And Midi asks Ankert's name, and he reveals it. Then he exchanges attacks with him again, and Midi says that he will remember that name, but Prota says that he doesn't need to, because if he forgets, he will remind him himself. And so Prota enters the mode of concentrating on a single point, turning everything around him gray. He says that his balance has changed to his right foot and he is preparing to cut diagonally, but in doing so he manages to dodge easily, saying that the technique he learned from today was the experience he gained through repetitions, and all of this culminated so that he can see his movements. While Mitch tries to attack him, Prota manages to cut his neck, but Mitch also manages to do the same to Prota, and Mitch is surprised for having been hit, and then he starts to get more desperate, asking what's going on because he thought he could defeat him with just a few moves. But he's having trouble against that piece of shit and thinks he can't accept this, because his fair and fluid sword technique is made for parrying. And he needs a precise attack and says that his supreme technique that he learned for this type of situation is an attack that starts from below, an attack that cuts everything in a huge arc, the spinning cut. However, Ankert thinks to himself that he can see the technique that he died from so many times, all because he couldn't see where and when it started. But this time he can see it and starts to smile totally sadistically, giving it to that sword, then he throws it away. And so, Mitch can't believe that he not only saw it but managed to parry it. And it is said about the Ruris, one of the three main houses that rule over the kingdom of Aspen. And the Ruria house represents the strength that springs from the kingdom and recruits all those who show talent with it. And Miffy says that he was also recruited by a regional house for this purpose. And after adopting the name Ruria, he proved himself along with his skills and faced 2 adult knights at just 15 years old, and defeated a city's champion swordsman at 18. And so he says that he was strong enough to be the champion of an entire city at 22, and became one of the 3 strongest fighters in the Grey Dogs, just with his skill, and there were few who matched his talents. He wonders why people train until their legs can't take it anymore, and why swing a sword until your hand bleeds, especially when it only takes a few attacks to win. He says he was satisfied with the present. He was confident in his skill, saying that this was a mistake on his part, and just at that moment, the protagonist not only deflects the attack, as he launches a counterattack, hitting Miffa's chest, and so, when he is stuck with his chest there, the protagonist quickly withdraws his sword, and Miff feels the pain of that attack, spitting blood, and Anchorage seems quite happy with this result, and then Miff says that he underestimated him because he thought that the attack would hit him for sure, and so he says that he is not as good as him in strength or technique. And in that, Prota says that he is right, but he won. And so, Miff starts to get pissed off because if he had tried harder instead of being complacent, it would have been different. And Prota says it was fun. But then, Another man arrives wanting to protect Miffy and throws Prota away with a sword, and so they ask him if he's okay. And the blonde tells them to take Emite to a safe place. And Prota turns around saying that he didn't imagine that the only man would cause so much trouble, saying that he won't have a peaceful death. Then Prota says he can't forget that he's surrounded by enemies, thinking he needs to break the flag and secure his break. And he thinks he's facing another wall, and says that that's the wall he has to overcome today. And so everyone shoots at him. But in this, Prota keeps moving forward, thinking that he can't dodge all the attacks and will receive them if he keeps advancing. Then the blonde says that he wouldn't dare to move forward and throws his sword in Prota's direction, and he starts to feel that after just one attack his sword is breaking, saying that his sword technique is extremely heavy and he is thrown back, thinking that to win that battle he will have to die many times. But he remembers that the objective now is another, and he has to destroy the flag, and so he throws one of the daggers at its cloth, saying that the medium in the spell, this will stop working even with the slightest damage. And so he almost hits it. Speaking of aiming at the flag, the dagger just goes straight through. And with that, Loro realizes what he's doing and almost hits it. However, Prota thinks he has to aim at the connection between the flag and the conductor. And so he actually manages to make the cloth come off the flag, and then all the snow starts to melt. And the fairy says she informed the commander that there would be a spell, and asked for resources to fight, but they didn't do anything. And she thinks this kingdom is rotten. And they sent a potato to command the front lines, saying that at this rate they'll be decimated. But then she realizes that all the snow is disappearing, and the enemy soldiers don't understand anything. So they ask what happened to the flag. But she starts killing them all and says that the enemies were taken completely by surprise with the disappearance of the Neva. And now is her chance to change the pace of the battle, and she orders all the men to counterattack. So everyone leaves, and she thinks that things are more favorable now that the Neva has dissipated. But she questions who destroyed the spell, wondering if it was that squad leader. And Prota, at that very moment, is in the worst situation of his life, full of thorns in his body, and he thinks he screwed up because after destroying the flag, he thought he would meet King Ohagna again if he had retreated to the Allied lines. But he wonders where they are, and at that very moment, the king is surrounded by several men, and he asks for a sorcerer to be brought to him, otherwise everyone will die. And Ragna is also surrounded. Meanwhile, some of the allies are watching, and he asks everyone to wait, and they wonder what the hell is this, asking if he wants to be executed. Meanwhile, Prota is also in a pretty bad situation, with the men asking if he thinks he will survive, telling him to give up. But then, that puma from that time appears, and he realizes that it is the puma he saw in the field. Then they talk about that beast and try to hit him, but he keeps jumping from soldier to soldier, stopping them all. And so he stops in front of Prota, defending him, but he tells her that it is better for him to leave because that guy there is different. And he keeps looking at Prota with a totally frightening look. But then, they tap Prota on the shoulder, telling him to go back, and Vengeance says he'll save him. He goes after the blonde guy, but then he's thrown away with a single attack and notices that he's very strong. So Pronto asks if he didn't say he was going to save him. Imagine this, Vengeance gets up and tells his gang to shoot them all, but the blonde guy stops, all the attacks come towards him, and Vengeance asks what that guy is calling him a monster, so Puma tries to go after him but ends up getting a huge beating and thrown away. And with that, Prota starts to enter focus mode on the single point, thinking he can see. However, he notices that he can't deflect that sword with his strength. So, he simply says that he needs to let it flow just like Mitch did. So, he manages to do Yo's, being hit by a very small amount in his shoulder. Then, the blonde realizes what is happening and notices that this is Mateo Pro's technique. With a completely bloodthirsty look, he thinks it worked, getting excited, so Vengeance helps him, trying to attack the blonde, but he manages to get out of the way. So several soldiers start to gather, and seeing that things are getting too tumultuous, he decides to simply give up the battle, saying that he will not forget about Prota. And Angrist tells him to be at ease. And so he orders all his troops to retreat. And with that, Vengeance runs towards Anchorage talking about his shoulder, saying that he has no bandage and they need to go back. But then Anchorage says that they also need to take the Puma, but in this he tells him to worry about himself, and he ends up picking up the Puma and carrying it in his arms. Then Anchorage shouts to the 3rd platoon, telling them to go to the rear because they are going to retreat. And then he asks Anchorage not to close his eyes, saying that he is losing a lot of blood, and so he begins to lose consciousness. Then Sharon says that he got what he wanted again, thinking that that bastard is very persistent, questioning what motivates him. While he is in this little meeting with the boatman, the war continues while Vengeance takes him back. Man, what a cool friendship, man. Both Vengeance, Puma, and Prota. Then, sometime later, when he opens his eyes again, he hears everyone talking. While some are worried, others are arguing, and that giant is praying, and Prota wonders what's going on because that thing in his hand is the Puma. sleeping with him like a kitten. Then Hank studies if he's woken up yet, because this time he thought he had really died. And the giant says again that God answered his prayers. So, to ask what's going on, Jackson asks if he's okay, giving him some water, saying that he lost a lot of blood. And Zyoto says that, fortunately, the doctor said that he won't have any lasting effects, and the goddess of luck must be by his side. While he drinks water, a lung ends up falling out. He starts to move, and Proto thinks he must have passed out during the retreat. Then Jackson says how he woke up. He goes along with it, while Ragnar goes to sleep a little more, and Proto thinks he's had another day, and then Rin looks at him, and Proto questions what he's staring at, asking if he wants to pet Poma. But he says he's not interested in the vacation, but asks how Angrus knew it was a spell. And Proto says he won't believe him if he tells him about repetitions, so he'll have to lie, but he refuses to do so, because Ren has always been loyal to him and he needs to repay his kindness, and he says he was friends with someone like him, a colonizer. He had only suspected based on what he heard from him, so he thinks this was perfect since he wasn't lied to, and he actually heard it from a colonizer, Hank himself. So he says that if he doesn't want to tell him, that's fine, but he just tells him not to be too interested in spells, that Proto thinks that despite his appearance, he really understands things quickly, but he also remembers to ask to Run what he was doing during the battle, and he says he went after the guy who found the flag, but he didn't like him very much, so he sent his head flying. And Proto remembers that he didn't see the wizard, and it was probably because Rin took care of him. Meanwhile, Soyuzo tries to touch Poma, but he almost bites him, and Proto asks him to be careful. However, Zyoto says he won't resist and will be left without 10,000 krona. He says he heard from Henry that because of that little guy's blue eyes, they call him the Panther of the Lake. They were supposed to hold the Earth's energy within them, and each of its claws is worth 10,000 krona. And his claws always grow back. And Proto thinks that a single bronze coin is worth 1 krona, and 10,000 must be worth a gold coin, thinking he's worth more than his pay. And he says that after he fainted, they dominated the battlefield with ease, since the fog had dissipated. But the battle itself was inconclusive, and they have not marched or ventured since. And the save he made, he wonders if he could do it again if he tried. But he thinks he is not sure. And even after some time, Jackson tells him to stop moving so much. But he says he's not exaggerating because he can move a little. However, Ragna says that the most he can do now is stretch, and he better go back to sleep. And Ren asks if he's trying to spread his laziness to Proto, telling him to get out of the way, and so he starts trying to get his sword, and Proto remembers that he has a question related to it, saying that he was able to use a technique which he had never practiced before, and he hadn't done anything like that, asking if it's normal. Then Ren says that this is normal, there's nothing special, and by using the heart of the beast he can see what the enemy is doing, so he would be able to see how he's swinging the sword and how he uses his strength. And Ragnar says that it must have been easier, since he learned the basics, and says that he was also able to use single-point focus. Then, for sure, he would have seen even more, and he says that he must have still been lucky, saying that at his level, this would only be possible after hundreds of real battles. And Proto thinks that it really is like that, because that day that passed was not just one day for him, it was hundreds of days of unimaginable hardships. He made sure through his hard work, not just by memorizing patterns in the days that repeated themselves, and he says that no matter how pathetic he is, he can get stronger. And so he talks to the two who are like water and oil asking for a duel. And Ren says that they call him a crazy man, but that guy is even more so. And Ragnar says that it is rare for him to agree with that sprout. But they question where he wants to go in those conditions, saying that with his body in that state, duels are out of the question, and so the fairy goes there, telling if he was the one who broke the spell. He says he figured the commander would start asking questions soon, but asks why the commander herself is doing this. He answers that it was him, and says he saw it while he was on patrol, and he also knew a little about it before. Then she says there were 5 replicas, asking how he found out the real one. So he says he guessed, and she just accepts it, saying it's okay. But then he questions if that's all she came to ask, and she says she also came to see his face, saying she thinks fate brought them together. Then he questions himself about fate. What is she talking about, and starts to get all silly, asking what the secret is, and Ragna questions if he had that kind of ability. But he says that it's not quite like that, telling them to be quiet. And Zoido appears, saying that it would be great if he opened a bar with him, saying that it will make things favorable. But Proto denies it and tells him to shut up. And he wonders why she is like that with him, because he is his boss's boss, and that is uncomfortable. But then Zoidro also says that there is news, saying that the Squire of the Order of Knights is there, and Proto widens his eyes at this information, thinking about the Order of Knights of Mount Scarlet, saying that the battalion he is part of is called the Cypros Division, and its name is in honor of a knight, and this Cypros is part of the Order of Knights of the Scarlet Mantle, and they are extremely skilled knights, and this holds true across the entire continent. And that's why the Order of Knights has so many more people than just knights. Squires serve the knight students. And when the squire is approved by his knight, he becomes a proto-knight. And above them are the knights, those who surpass the squire. And Proto says that squires rarely fight in battle without their knight. So this squire is about to become a proto-knight. And so he calls everyone to battle. And Zyoto says that maybe they were waiting for the knight, and now they're leaving, and Rin says that it's better for him to rest for now. But Proto thinks that he wants to see him, and Rin looks back, saying that he can see that he wants to come with them, and he thinks that he probably won't have anything to do. So Proto thinks that this is the ideal that he kept as a dream, a small piece of that dream, and he looks at that man who is before his eyes, and while Proto Knight continues going forward with that bunch of people with bows in their hands, the last thing he does for sure is fart. And with that rain of spears coming towards him, he just bends down, pulling out his sword, getting ready to run. And Proto thinks that he used the determination in his legs, and so he advances at a completely absurd speed, doing at least 100 meters in half a second, getting close to the enemy army, and with just one swing of the sword he lifts at least 20 people, and Proto almost can't believe what he's looking at. Okay, I said that this guy here didn't have any power, but I think I'm gonna start rethinking, because this isn't normal. No, it's not normal. And all the knight's allies wonder what that is, because he keeps cleaning up just by swinging his sword, and everyone wants to retreat. And the enemy commander orders them to stop him, but his head disappears without him even noticing. And so the knight steps on the horse's head, while Proto continues to be astonished by what he is seeing. And Rin says that that guy is not bad at all. And it's not for nothing that he is called a war expert. And Ragna thinks that at that level he thinks he could do it, while Jackson says that the enemy has at least 5 opportunities to stop him, and the enemy commander is incompetent. Look, I'm starting to think that Proto's little group is a little absurd, because they are treating this as if it were nothing. So the other one keeps praying, while Zoido says that this will end without them having to do anything. And Proto wonders about the squire's sword style, and says that it is not sword art. And the heavy sword art is a powerful and colossal sword technique, and it uses force to cut through everything and dominate the opponent. And the disorienting sword art is a confusing sword technique, and it deceives and corners the opponent. And Valen's sword technique is based on that technique. And he says that the fluid sword art is a fast technique that overcomes your enemy with speed. And the last one is a soft and gentle sword technique that it deflects enemy attacks and counterattacks. He thinks that the art of the heavy sword and the art of the fluid sword are opposites, but he can see both in that guy, so he thinks that they may have different characteristics, but all these techniques started in one place. He thinks that the important thing is to understand what all 5 have in common and to wield the sword as if it were alive. And so, he closes his eyes and begins to concentrate. And Ren and Ragna look at him smiling and begin to say that the squad leader is about to overcome something, telling them not to let them disturb him. Meanwhile, Ongrid thinks that nothing changes despite his understanding, because understanding is nothing, and he returns to that place where he saw a much higher wall, saying that it exists only to show him how much higher he has to climb. So, he begins to think that he will reach the top. While all that battle is going on, he remains still and continues meditating until his army wins, and he says that the war is coming to an end, and the next winters and springs will be full. And it is said that the Principality of Aspen is controlled by 3 main families, and the one sitting on the throne is the Sovereign of Aspen. And he starts to say that those bastards broke the good manners agreement of not bringing any knights. And Ruriel, the powerful one, continues with him, while Atkins, the administrator, continues to read everything he has to say. They say that they used General Toad as an excuse, and the Toads demanded a response from knights. So there is not much to do. And they start to say that that damn General Toad ended up going ahead without orders. Then they say that the frog species usually does whatever it wants, and they would probably find some excuse anyway. And they say that this wouldn't have happened if the spell had worked. And the Sovereign says that the Grey Dogs, and will pay for this. And Odoro says that this won't end well for them. Meanwhile, Proto says that after a long war, the Aspen forces have returned, and so have they. They have returned to the Border Guard, the city's remote fortress. And with its proximity to Aspen, the city is heavily militarized, with 1 in 5 people being a soldier. And where the leaders begin by thanking the many heroes in the ear, they say that they led this war to victory, and says that he will now reward the common soldiers who have proven their courage and loyalty, and he calls Anchorage from the 4th Squad, saying that he will be rewarded for destroying the vile Aspen spell. Saying that he rewards him, and everyone is shocked that the useless squad leader was called asking how that idiot broke the spell, and they say that that guy is weak as hell, saying that this is impossible, questioning if he isn't just stealing his squad's credits, saying that he must have licked the commander's ass. But another says that maybe he can be good at something more. But then Max shows up telling him to climb up his ass mouth, and Andrew says that he is not someone he can talk to like that, and so Henry thinks that Anchorage is much more than that, so he receives a sum of money, and the Lloyds soon ask what he is going to do. Would it be drinks or women? Asking if he wants any recommendations. He says he wants a good shop, asking for the best blacksmith in town. Then, they are shocked that he is going to spend all that money buying a sword. And Zoido says that the common sword is not that bad, and also says that there are several swords fallen on the battlefield, and only the ones he picked up serve as supplies for the squad for the rest of his life. So he says that to become a knight, he needs to prove his strength. And the stingy Zoyo keeps asking why he needs something so expensive. And Prota says he is going to take the soldier promotion exam, and he thinks that his time as a low-level soldier is over. I am impressed that he is a low-level soldier, leading this gang of very strong psychopaths. And I still can't believe they thought the Pronto Cavallero demo was something common. And if you want the sequel, leave a like and I'll definitely bring you more. I really liked Manhwa and I hope you like it too. See you in the next video. I'm going.